The morning fog rolled through Arlington National Cemetery like something alive, something that remembered. Jack Rearden stood motionless before a headstone that had worn smooth under 40 years of weather and grief. The granite read simple words that could never capture what they meant. Colonel James Rearden, United States Army, killed in action, Chosin, February 1968. Jack was 8 years old when the uniformed officer came to the door. 8 years old when his mother collapsed in the hallway. 8 years old when he learned that some men don't come home from war. He was 58 now, gray threading through dark hair that he still kept military short out of habit. The body was still fit, still capable, though the shoulder ached in cold weather from a bullet that found its mark in Kandahar. The face was weathered in that way that comes from decades of sun and sand and choices that age a man faster than time ever could. He wore civilian clothes now, jeans and a canvas jacket, but anyone who'd served would recognize the way he stood. You could take the soldier out of the army, but some things never left. A voice interrupted the silence, roughened by decades of unfiltered cigarettes and classified operations that didn't make it into history books. "Jack, I thought I might find you here." He turned to see Raymond Walsh approaching through the mist, moving carefully with the cane that had become necessary after too many years and too many wars. Walsh was 65, white-haired, with eyes that had seen things that men weren't meant to see and lived with them anyway. They'd known each other for 35 years, since Jack was a fresh Special Forces captain and Walsh was running black operations out of Langley that didn't have names or budgets that Congress knew about. "Morning, Ray?" Jack's voice carried the flat affect of someone who'd said too many goodbyes to too many graves. Walsh stood beside him, looking at the headstone. "Your father was a hell of a soldier. I read the after-action reports from Chosin. What he did that day, holding that position while his company evacuated, that was something beyond courage. That was choosing to die so others could live. He made his choice." Jack's jaw tightened. "And I've been trying to figure out if it was worth it ever since." The fog shifted, revealing rows upon rows of white markers stretching into the distance. 70,000 men and women lay under this ground, each one a choice, each one a sacrifice, each one a question that had no answer. Walsh pulled an envelope from his jacket, worn leather cracked at the edges. "I need you for one more, Jack. I know you're retired. I know you've earned your peace. But this one requires someone who's been where you've been, seen what you've seen, and still believes it matters." Jack took the envelope but didn't open it. The paper felt heavy in his hands, weighted with whatever mission Walsh had brought to the cemetery of missions past. Fort Campbell, 4 recruits hospitalized in the last 6 weeks, officially listed as training injuries. Unofficially, we've got indicators of something worse, much worse. Jack opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, medical reports, classified intelligence assessments. A young private with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. Another with burns that the official report called accidental, but the pattern suggested otherwise. A third who tried to hang himself in the barracks and survived only because his bunkmate found him in time. Training accidents. Jack's voice carried the weight of knowing better. On the surface, Walsh handed him another photograph, this one showing Chinese soldiers running a tactical drill. Look at their formation. Look at how they're moving through that urban environment. That's not Chinese doctrine, that's American. Specifically, that's 101st Airborne Air Assault tactics, perfected over 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. Tactics that are classified. Tactics that should not exist in any Chinese training manual. Someone's selling. Jack studied the photograph, his experienced eye catching details that confirmed Walsh's assessment. The spacing, the hand signals, the way they stacked on a doorway. It was American doctrine, no question. For 18 months, we've tracked the leak to Fort Campbell. Tactical manuals, force protection protocols, counter-IED procedures, everything we learned in blood over 2 decades of war. It's all being sold to Chinese MSS. And they're using the training pipeline as cover, creating chaos and casualties to hide the theft. Walsh pulled out another photograph, this one of a man in his early 50s, with the hard edges and cold eyes of someone who'd seen combat and been changed by it. Major Viktor Volkov, Russian-born, came to America at 12, naturalized, commissioned through ROTC, decorated in 3 tours of Afghanistan. Bronze Star with Valor Device, Purple Heart, the whole Christmas tree. He's the company commander at Fort Campbell, and he's our primary suspect. Jack studied the photograph. The face showed intelligence, discipline, and something else. Something that looked like disillusionment, like a man who'd believed once and didn't anymore. You think he's selling to the Chinese? Jack's statement carried no question. The intelligence points to him, but we need proof. We need documentation, recorded conversations, evidence that will hold up in a military court. Walsh met Jack's eyes. That's why I need you. You're going in as an instructor. Sergeant First Class Tom Mitchell, Special Forces veteran, doing a lateral retrain before retirement. The cover gives you access to the training companies, puts you in position to observe Volkov and his cadre, and your SF background makes the transition believable. Jack folded the photographs, feeling the familiar weight settling onto his shoulders. The weight of a mission, of choices that would have to be made, of lines that might have to be crossed. I'm 58 years old, Ray. I've got a shoulder that barely works and knees that sound like gravel. Why not send someone younger? Walsh smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Because younger operators don't have your pattern recognition. They haven't seen what you've seen. You were in Vietnam's tail end. You were in the Gulf. You were in Iraq and Afghanistan. You've watched this movie before. You know how betrayal smells before it announces itself. The fog was lifting now, revealing the full scope of Arlington's dead. 70,000 stories, 70,000 choices, 70,000 men and women who'd made the same calculation Jack was making now. There's something else. Walsh's voice dropped lower. The handler buying this intelligence, we've identified him. His name is Li Wei, Chinese MSS, operating under diplomatic cover. He's the link to Beijing, the man who pays for American blood and calls it business. We get Volkov, we get Li Wei, we shut down a pipeline that's been feeding Chinese intelligence for over a year. Jack looked at his father's grave one more time, reading those dates that bookended a life cut short. Born 1940, died 1968, 28 years old when he held that position at Khe Sanh so his men could evacuate. 28 years old when he chose to die rather than retreat. My father fought communists in the jungle. Jack's voice was quiet but carried an edge like breaking glass. Spent 2 tours in Vietnam pushing back against an ideology that wanted to swallow Asia. Died believing that America was worth dying for, that freedom mattered more than survival. And now you're telling me someone's selling our doctrine to the same ideology he died fighting. Not the same, Walsh corrected. Worse. The Soviets were ideologues. They believed in something, even if we thought it was wrong. The Chinese are pragmatists. They're building an empire, and they're buying it with American blood and American tactics. They'll use what we sell them to kill our sons and daughters when they invade Taiwan. That's what's at stake, Jack, the next war, and whether it's fought with our own weapons turned against us. Jack pulled an object from his pocket, something he had been carrying for 40 years. A medal, bronze star with a V device. His father's decoration for that action at Khe Sanh. The ribbon was faded, the metal tarnished, but the weight of it never changed. When do I ship out? Walsh handed him another envelope, thicker this time. Tomorrow. We've backdated your service records, created the cover identity, established your legend. As far as the Army's concerned, Tom Mitchell is real and his background is solid. You'll go through in-processing like any other instructor transferring to Fort Campbell. You'll have full access to training companies and command staff. He pulled out a medical scanner, small enough to fit in a closed fist. This is Omega Black. It's subcutaneous, embedded in your forearm. You won't feel it after the first week. 3 taps in sequence, and you activate the highest level extraction protocol we have. Not just quick reaction force. Full special mission unit response. Delta, DevGru, whatever's closest. Because if this goes wrong, Jack, if Volkov makes you, you're not just another undercover operative. You're a 58-year-old man alone in a nest of vipers who've already shown they're willing to hurt people to protect their operation. Jack took the scanner, feeling its weight. When he'd started doing this work, extraction protocols meant a phone call and a prayer. Now they could track heartbeats and body temperature, deploy rescue teams faster than he could bleed out. Progress, they called it. He called it a reminder that the missions kept getting more dangerous and the operators kept getting older. One more thing. Walsh's tone shifted, became personal in a way that operational briefings rarely allowed. Marcus Stone is the base commander at Fort Campbell. You served with him in the Gulf. Good man, solid officer. He's been read into the operation. He'll be your lifeline if things go sideways. But Jack, He doesn't know I'm sending you specifically. As far as he's concerned, DIA is sending an experienced operator. When he finds out it's you, it might complicate things. You two have history. We all have history. Jack closed his hand around the scanner. The question is whether it helps or hurts. Walsh nodded, understanding what Jack wasn't saying. The older you got, the more history you accumulated, and the more likely that history would walk through a door at the worst possible moment. Your father would be proud. Walsh gestured at the grave. What you've done, what you're about to do, it honors his sacrifice. Or it compounds it. Jack looked at those dates one more time. Mathematics of a life. Maybe I'm just making the same mistake he did. Maybe we're all making the same mistake, thinking that one more mission will make a difference, that one more sacrifice will tip the balance. Maybe we're just feeding more young men into the same meat grinder that took him. Maybe. Walsh leaned on his cane, looking every one of his 65 years. But the alternative is letting men like Volkov sell everything your father died for. Letting Chinese soldiers study our tactics so they can kill our children more efficiently. That's not a mistake, Jack. That's surrender. And neither you nor your father were ever very good at that. They stood in silence for a moment, two old warriors at a grave, having a conversation that happened 10,000 times a day in every cemetery where soldiers lay. The question of whether it was worth it. The question of whether it ever ended. The question of whether the next mission would be the one that finally made sense of all the others. Jack placed his father's medal on the headstone, bronze star, against gray granite. I'll bring it back. When this is over, I'll bring it back and tell you the story. You can decide if I did right. He turned and walked through the lifting fog, Walsh beside him, both men moving with the careful deliberation of bodies that had been broken and put back together too many times. Behind them, Arlington stretched into the distance, 70,000 conversations frozen in stone, 70,000 questions waiting for answers that would never come. The next morning, Jack Rearden became someone else. He'd done it enough times that the transformation felt like muscle memory. The external changes were easy. Different uniform, different name tape, different bearing. Sergeant First Class Tom Mitchell moved like a senior NCO, competent but not exceptional. The kind of career soldier who'd done his time and was coasting toward retirement. The internal changes were harder. You had to believe the lie, had to inhabit it so completely that when someone looked at you, they saw the cover instead of the truth. The drive to Fort Campbell took him through Kentucky countryside that looked like it hadn't changed since his father's time. Tobacco fields and small towns, American flags on front porches. The kind of landscape that people fought for without quite being able to articulate why. It was home in some fundamental way, even for someone like Jack, who'd spent more years overseas than domestic. It was what you pictured when you were bleeding in some Afghan valley, what you held on to when the bullets were close and the chances were poor. Fort Campbell sprawled across the Tennessee-Kentucky border, 105,000 acres of training grounds, airfields, and history. Home of the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, a unit that had jumped into Normandy and held Bastogne and done 1,000 other things that became legend. The main gate sign proclaimed it proudly, home of the 101st Airborne Division, Air Assault. Young soldiers stood guard, checking IDs, waving traffic through, not knowing that one of the vehicles contained a lie that would either save or destroy everything this base represented. Jack reported to the personnel office, presented his orders, went through the bureaucratic machinery that turned a person into a soldier in the system. Fingerprints, dental records, security clearance verification. Each step, another layer of authenticity added to the cover. By the time he walked out of that building, Tom Mitchell existed in every database that mattered. The briefing with General Marcus Stone happened that afternoon, in an office that looked like every commander's space Jack had ever seen. Awards and photographs on the walls, unit guidons in the corners, a desk that had seen better days and would probably see worse. Stone was 62, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had earned every line through command decisions that never got easier. He stood when Jack entered, and for a moment, recognition flashed across his features. Rearden, Stone's voice carried genuine warmth. Raymond said he was sending someone experienced, but I didn't know it would be you. It's been, what, 20 years? 23. Desert Storm. You were a major, I was a captain. We held that supply route outside Kuwait City for 18 hours while the main force moved through. I remember. Stone gestured to a chair, then closed the door. That was the longest night of my career. Thought we were going to die out there about 6 different times. You kept everyone calm, kept them fighting. That's why I recommended you for promotion afterward. Jack sat, feeling the weight of shared history. It complicated things, just like Walsh had predicted. Easier to lie to strangers. Friends remembered who you used to be, which made it harder to pretend to be someone else. Raymond briefed me on the situation. Stone opened a file, classified markers stamped across the cover. Major Victor Volkov. I brought him to Fort Campbell myself, recommended him for company command. I served with him in Afghanistan, saw him in action. He was one of the best young officers I'd ever worked with. Smart, dedicated, genuinely cared about his soldiers. Stone's jaw tightened. If he's the one selling secrets to Chinese intelligence, if he's the traitor, then I missed it. And that failure is on me. You can't see everything. Jack kept his voice neutral, professional. Betrayal works because the people doing it are good at hiding it. If they were obvious, they'd be easy to stop. Maybe, but I should have seen something. Changes in behavior, financial irregularities, anything. Stone looked at the file like it contained his own indictment. I've known Victor for 8 years, went to his wedding, visited him in the hospital after he took shrapnel in Kandahar. How do you miss that someone you trust is selling your country out? That's why I'm here. Jack met his eyes. To find what you couldn't see from the inside. Sometimes you need an outsider's perspective, someone without the emotional connections. Stone nodded, but the guilt remained visible in his expression. You'll be operating under instructor cover, running training alongside Volkov's cadre. That puts you in position to observe without raising suspicion. But Jack, understand something. If Victor is dirty, he's not alone. You don't run an operation like this solo. He's got help, probably multiple people in his chain of command, which means you'll be surrounded by potential hostiles who don't know you're watching. I've been surrounded before. Jack's tone carried the flat certainty of experience. I'm still here. You were 30 then. Stone's observation wasn't criticism, just fact. You're 58 now. Don't let pride get you killed. Pride's got nothing to do with it. Jack stood, signaling the briefing was over. I'm here because someone needs to stop this. Because my father died fighting communists, and I'll be damned if I let someone sell American doctrine to them for profit. Age doesn't change that math. Stone stood as well, extended his hand. For what it's worth, I'm glad it's you. If anyone can navigate this mess without getting killed, it's someone who's been doing it as long as you have. Just remember, you're not invulnerable. None of us are. They shook hands, 2 old warriors acknowledging the truth that neither wanted to admit. Every mission might be the last one. Every operation carried risks that compounded with age. But you went anyway, because the alternative was letting younger men carry weights they shouldn't have to lift alone. Jack met Major Victor Volkov that evening in the company headquarters building, where fluorescent lights hummed with a particular frequency that every soldier recognized. The office was standard military issue, spare and functional, with training schedules on the walls and equipment rosters on the desk. Volkov stood when Jack entered, and the first thing that struck him was the eyes. Cold, intelligent, calculating. The eyes of someone who'd seen combat and been changed by it. Sergeant First Class Mitchell. Volkov's voice carried the faintest trace of an accent, Russian vowels under American consonants. Your reputation precedes you. Special forces, multiple deployments, experienced instructor. We're glad to have you. Thank you, sir. Jack kept his posture appropriate for a sergeant addressing a major. Looking forward to contributing to the training mission. Volkov moved around the desk, studying Jack with an intensity that felt like being under a microscope. Tom Mitchell, according to your records, 35 years of service, most of it in special operations. Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan. You've seen things that most of these young soldiers can't imagine. He paused. But I'm curious about something. Special forces don't usually lateral retrain to become drill instructors. That's typically where we put soldiers who aren't fit for frontline work anymore. So why are you here, Sergeant Mitchell? Really? The question came faster than Jack had anticipated. He'd planned to ease into the cover, build credibility slowly. But Volkov was pushing immediately, testing, probing for inconsistencies. Got old, sir. Got tired. Spent 3 decades doing the work. Figured I'd spend my last few years passing knowledge to the next generation. Maybe save some lives by teaching these kids what I learned the hard way. Volkov smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. A noble sentiment, teaching the next generation, making sure our sacrifices weren't wasted. He walked to the window, looking out at the training grounds, where young soldiers were running formations in the fading light. Tell me, Sergeant Mitchell, do you think our sacrifices meant anything? All those years in Afghanistan, in Iraq, all that blood and treasure spent, did we accomplish anything worth the cost? The question carried weight beyond its words. This wasn't small talk. This was a test, feeling out Jack's worldview, determining whether he was truly the burned-out NCO the cover suggested or something else. We did our duty, sir. Whether it was worth it isn't for me to judge. I just followed orders and tried to bring my men home alive. Followed orders. Volkov's voice carried something that might have been contempt or might have been recognition. Yes, that's what we're trained to do. Follow orders, execute the mission, trust that the people above us know what they're doing. But what happens when you realize they don't? When you watch 20 years of war end with the Taliban back in power and America retreating in chaos? What happens when you realize that every soldier who died, every tactic we perfected, every lesson we learned was for nothing because the politicians threw it all away? Jack felt ice water run through his veins. This wasn't just disillusionment. This was ideology, belief system, the kind of conviction that justified betrayal. I try not to think about it too much, sir. Thinking doesn't change what happened, just makes it harder to sleep. Volkov turned back from the window, those cold eyes studying Jack. You're either very wise or very naive, Sergeant Mitchell. I haven't decided which yet. He returned to his desk, pulled out a training schedule. You'll start tomorrow morning, 0500, PT formation, then tactical training. Master Sergeant Decker runs most of the hands-on instruction. He's former Delta, good soldier, doesn't tolerate weakness. You'll work well with him. Looking forward to it, sir. One more thing. Volkov's tone shifted, became almost casual. You look familiar. Have we met before? Maybe in Afghanistan? Your face seems like something I should remember. Jack's heart rate didn't spike. His breathing didn't change. 40 years of experience kept his body language neutral, even as his mind raced through possibilities. Volkov had recognized something, some ghost of Jack Rearden under the Tom Mitchell cover. Don't think so, sir. I was mostly in remote areas, small unit operations. Didn't interact much with conventional forces. Perhaps. Volkov made a note on his desk pad. Well, welcome to Fort Campbell, Sergeant Mitchell. I'm sure we'll get to know each other well over the coming weeks. Jackie saluted, executed a proper about-face, and left the office. Once outside, he allowed himself a long exhale. The first meeting was always the most dangerous. First impressions set patterns, and patterns either reinforced the cover or undermined it. Volkov was suspicious. That much was clear. Whether the suspicion was general wariness or specific recognition remained to be seen. He walked through the base as evening settled, watching young soldiers moving between barracks and dining facilities. Kids, most of them, 18 and 19 years old, playing at being warriors before reality taught them what that actually meant. Some of them would learn. Some wouldn't survive the lesson. And if Jack failed in his mission, some would die because enemies had purchased American tactics and turned them into weapons. The barracks they'd assigned him were separate from the trainee housing, a small room in the instructor building that smelled like stale coffee and old regrets. Jack unpacked his gear, placed the photograph he'd brought on the small desk. His father in Vietnam-era fatigues, young and alive, before Chosin, before the choice that ended him. Next to it, he placed a more recent photograph, one that Walsh had included in the mission package. 4 young soldiers in hospital beds, victims of the training injuries that weren't accidents, casualties of a conspiracy that valued money over lives. He pulled out his encrypted phone, the device that connected him to Walsh and DIA headquarters, and composed a brief message. First contact made. Volkov suspicious but cover holding. Beginning observation phase tomorrow. Will report after initial training cycle. The response came quickly. Understood. Omega Black active. Maintain cover. Remember your mission. And Jack, be careful, you're not as young as you used to be. Jack deleted the messages, encrypted the phone, and hid it in the false bottom of his duffel bag. Then he lay on the narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Fort Campbell at night. Distant voices, engines, the rhythms of a military base that never truly slept. Somewhere out there, Viktor Volkov was planning something. Somewhere out there, American secrets were being packaged and sold. Somewhere out there, the next generation was being betrayed by the one that came before. Jack thought about his father, about that choice at Chosin, about 28 years lived and ended in service of something larger than self. He thought about the weight of those choices, how they echoed through time, how sons inherited the wars their fathers fought, and sometimes the same graves they occupied. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, he'd meet the soldiers he was supposed to betray through silence, the young men whose suffering he'd document instead of prevent. Tomorrow, he'd start walking the line between mission and morality, between following orders and following conscience. But tonight, in this small room that smelled like every deployment he'd ever endured, Jack Rearden allowed himself one moment of honest fear. Not of death, he'd made peace with that possibility decades ago, but of becoming the thing he hunted, of crossing so many lines that when he looked in the mirror, he wouldn't recognize the man looking back. The morning came too early and too cold, as military mornings always did. Jack was up at 04:30, dressed and ready before the wake-up call echoed through the buildings. Muscle memory from 40 years of service. The body knowing what to do before the mind fully engaged. He stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the trainees stumble from their barracks. Watch them form up in ragged lines that would either sharpen into formations or break under pressure. Master Sergeant Carl Decker stood at the front of the formation, a man built like violence and wearing it comfortably. Late 40s, shaved head, the kind of physical presence that announced combat experience before words were necessary. Jack recognized the type immediately. Former Tier 1 operator, someone who'd done the darkest work in the darkest places and carried it like armor. Decker's eyes swept across the formation, cataloging weaknesses, identifying targets. Listen up. Decker's voice could have stripped paint. I am Master Sergeant Decker. For the next 8 weeks, I am your mother, your father, your priest, and your worst nightmare. You will address me as Master Sergeant. You will speak only when spoken to. You will do exactly what I say when I say it, how I say it, or you will discover depths of misery you did not know existed. Standard drill sergeant speech, delivered with the particular enthusiasm of someone who believed every word. Jack watched the trainees' faces, saw fear and determination in varying measures. Most of them would make it through. Most, but not all. Some would break, wash out, go home with stories about how basic training was too hard. Those were the lucky ones. The unlucky ones would break differently, in ways that didn't heal, in ways that hospitals documented as training accidents. Sergeant Mitchell. Decker's attention swiveled to Jack. You'll be assisting with tactical training this morning. Why don't you introduce yourself to our future soldiers? Jack stepped forward, feeling 40 pairs of eyes on him. He'd done this before, the introduction, the establishment of credibility. But this time felt different, weighted with deception. I'm Sergeant First Class Mitchell, 35 years, most of it in Special Forces. I've done things I can't talk about in places you haven't heard of. I'm here to teach you how to stay alive when everything's trying to kill you. Pay attention, follow instructions, and maybe you'll make it home someday. That's all I've got. Short, direct, forgettable. Exactly what Tom Mitchell would say. Exactly what would keep him in the background, observing without drawing focus. The PT session that followed was brutal by design. Running, push-ups, obstacles, all of it designed to break spirits and build endurance. Jack participated, maintaining the pace, showing competence without excellence. Tom Mitchell would be fit for his age, capable but not exceptional. Jack Rearden could have outpaced half these trainees, even at 58. But Jack Rearden didn't exist here. Only the cover, only the lie. He watched Decker work, saw the way the Master Sergeant singled out certain soldiers for extra attention. A kid named Danny Kowalski, Polish immigrant family, who looked like he was trying too hard to prove something. Another named Tyler Jackson, African-American, quiet, who seemed to fold inward when Decker's attention landed on him. These were the targets, Jack realized. These were the ones who'd end up in hospitals with training injuries, or worse. Kowalski. Decker stood over the young private as he struggled through push-ups. What's your story? Why are you here? Sir, my father wanted me to serve. He worked in a factory his whole life, died before he could see me enlist. I'm doing this for him, sir. For him, Decker's voice dripped contempt. Not for you, not for your country, for a dead man who can't see what you're doing. That's the wrong reason, Private. That's the reason that gets people killed. Jack watched the exchange, saw Danny's face flushed with shame and anger. The kid was tough, that was clear. Tough enough to take abuse and keep going. But everyone had a breaking point, and Decker seemed determined to find it. The morning stretched into tactical training, moving through urban warfare scenarios, room clearing, convoy operations. Standard infantry work, the kind of thing that soldiers had been learning for generations. But Jack noticed something in the way Decker taught. The tactics were current, updated, specific. These weren't generic military doctrines. These were lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan, refined through blood and failure. Precisely the kind of knowledge that Chinese intelligence would pay premium prices to acquire. He documented everything mentally, knowing that written notes were too dangerous. The specific techniques, the way information flowed, the emphasis Decker placed on certain procedures, all of it would go into his reports. All of it would become evidence, assuming he survived long enough to file those reports. Lunch was in the dining facility, surrounded by hundreds of soldiers eating and talking, the noise level that made surveillance difficult, but also made private conversations easier. Jack sat alone initially, eating mechanically, watching the room. Then a tray settled across from him. Danny Kowalski, the kid Decker had been targeting that morning. "Sergeant Mitchell, mind if I sit?" "It's a free country." Jack didn't look up from his food. Danny ate in silence for a moment, then spoke quietly. "You served in Afghanistan?" "Multiple tours." "Did you ever—" Danny hesitated, choosing words carefully. "Did you ever feel like the instructors were pushing beyond training? Like they weren't trying to make you better, just trying to break you?" Jack looked up, met the kid's eyes, saw the question beneath the question, the fear that couldn't be directly expressed. "Training's supposed to be hard, supposed to push you past what you think are your limits. That's how you know what you're really capable of." "I get that, but there's a difference between hard and cruel, between pushing someone to be better and just enjoying their pain." Danny's jaw tightened. "Decker doesn't act like he's training us. He acts like he hates us." "Maybe he does," Jack kept his voice neutral. "Some instructors, they've seen too much combat, done too many tours. They come back different, harder. Can't relate to soft civilians anymore, so they try to beat the softness out, thinking that's helping." "Is it helping?" "Sometimes. Sometimes it just breaks people who could have been good soldiers if they'd been built up instead of torn down." Danny nodded, processing this. "Thanks, Sergeant, for the straight answer. Most instructors just tell us to shut up and follow orders." "That's also good advice." Jack returned to his meal. "But since you asked, here's more. Keep your head down. Do the work. Don't give Decker more reasons to single you out. The best way to survive training is to be invisible. Not too good, not too bad. Just average enough that they forget your name." Danny stood, picking up his tray. "I'll try. But my dad didn't raise me to be invisible. He raised me to stand up even when it's hard." He walked away before Jack could respond, leaving him with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd just met someone who was going to make this mission much more complicated. Because Danny Kowalski wasn't going to stay invisible. He was going to push back against Decker, was going to stand up for others, was going to become a target. And when that happened, Jack would have to decide whether maintaining his cover was worth watching a kid who reminded him of himself at that age get destroyed. The afternoon brought more training, this time in hand-to-hand combat. Jack partnered with various trainees, demonstrating techniques, correcting form. Standard military combatives. Nothing exotic, nothing that would reveal his actual skill level. But he watched Decker work with Tyler Jackson, saw the way the master sergeant applied just a little too much force, held joint locks just a little too long, pushed past instruction into something darker. Tyler took it silently, his face betraying nothing, but Jack recognized the signs. This wasn't the first time. This was a pattern, systematic abuse, hidden under the cover of aggressive training. And Tyler was enduring it alone, not complaining, not reporting, because reporting meant being labeled weak, being singled out further. After training, Jack found himself walking with Decker back toward the instructor barracks. The master sergeant moved with the easy confidence of someone who owned every space he occupied. "You did good work today, Mitchell. Solid instruction, appropriate force. Some of these new instructors, they're too soft. Forget that we're preparing these kids for combat, not summer camp. I try to find the balance. Tough enough to prepare them, controlled enough not to cause permanent damage. Decker laughed, harsh sound without humor. Permanent damage is part of the job. They need to learn what it feels like to get hurt, to fight through pain. Otherwise, the first time they take a bullet, they fold. Better they learn here in training than over there where it costs lives. True enough, but there's training pain, and then there's just pain. Jack kept his voice carefully neutral. One builds soldiers, the other just builds medical bills. Decker stopped walking, turned to face Jack directly. You got soft opinions about how I run my training, Sergeant Mitchell? Not opinions, observations. You're senior to me in this command, Master Sergeant. I'm just here to assist and learn the local procedures. Good, because Major Volkov runs a tight ship. He expects results, expects these trainees to graduate as warriors, not as broken children who can't handle reality. We do whatever's necessary to achieve that. You got a problem with necessary, then maybe this isn't the right assignment for you. Jack met his eyes, saw the challenge there. This was a test, feeling out whether Tom Mitchell was someone who'd go along or push back. The safe answer was agreement, was becoming part of the system. The moral answer was resistance, was refusing to participate in abuse. Jack chose the path between. I don't have a problem with necessary. I've done necessary things in places where necessary was the only option. But I also know the difference between mission requirements and personal gratification. As long as what we're doing serves the mission, we're good. Decker studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, you'll do fine here, Mitchell. Just remember, the mission isn't making these kids feel good about themselves. The mission is making them hard enough to survive what's coming. And what's coming is going to be bad. He walked away, leaving Jack standing in the fading light, feeling like he'd just been evaluated and provisionally accepted into something that he wasn't sure he wanted to be part of. But that was the cost of the cover. You didn't just pretend to be someone else. You had to convince people that you shared their worldview, shared their methods, shared their willingness to cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. That night, Jack filed his first real report to Walsh. Encrypted message, coded language, dry recitation of observations that translated to horror when decoded. Systematic abuse of trainees. Decker primary actor, Volkov likely aware and approving. Training methods specifically use updated tactics from recent combat operations. Indicators suggest documentation of these tactics for external transmission. Recommend continued observation to identify full network before action. The response came quickly. Concur with assessment. Maintain cover. Document everything. Evidence of intelligence sale requires direct observation of transfer or recorded admission. You're doing good work. Stay safe. Stay safe. Jack almost laughed at that. Safety stopped being an option the moment he drove through Fort Campbell's gate. Now there was only the mission and the question of how much damage he'd do to himself and others in service of completing it. He lay in his bunk, listening to the night sounds, thinking about Danny Kowalski and Tyler Jackson and all the other young soldiers whose suffering he was documenting instead of preventing. Thought about his father's choice at Chosin, dying so others could live. Wondered if there was nobility in making that choice or just tragedy. Wondered if 40 years later, Jack was making the same choice in a different form, trading morality for mission, conscience for completion, doing wrong in service of eventual right. The photograph of his father stared at him from the desk, young face frozen in a time before Chosin, before the choice, before the end. Jack whispered to that frozen image, words that no one else would hear. I hope you understand what I'm doing. I hope if you're watching, you see the reason behind the choices. Because right now, I'm not sure I do. Right now, I just know that someone has to stop this, and I'm the one who's here. So I'll lie to people who deserve truth. I'll watch suffering I could prevent. I'll become something less than what you raised me to be. And I'll do it all in your name, hoping that somewhere in this mess there's honor. There has to be honor, because if there isn't, then what the hell have we been fighting for all these years? No answer came from the photograph. No answer ever came. There was just the mission, and the morning that would arrive too soon, and the weight that got heavier with every choice that pushed him further from the man he used to be. But Jack Rearden, or Tom Mitchell, or whoever he was becoming in the space between identities, would wake up and put on the uniform and play the role, because someone had to, because his father had made his choice at 28. And at 58, Jack was still making the same one. The night deepened. Fort Campbell fell quiet except for the guard posts and the insomniacs. And in a small room that smelled like every deployment he'd ever endured, Jack closed his eyes and waited for tomorrow's lies to begin. The second week at Fort Campbell brought rain that turned the training grounds into mud and misery. Jack stood in the downpour watching 40 young soldiers struggle through an obstacle course that had been difficult in dry weather and was now nearly impossible. Decker walked the course like a predator, his voice cutting through the storm, picking apart every mistake, every moment of weakness, every sign that a trainee might be human instead of machine. Jack had seen this kind of training before, had endured it himself 4 decades ago, when the Army was different, but also exactly the same. The faces changed, the equipment improved, but the fundamental transaction remained constant. The military took soft civilians and broke them down, rebuilt them as soldiers, and hoped that what emerged was harder than what went in. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it just created broken people who wore uniforms. He watched Danny Kowalski attack the rope climb for the third time, hands raw and bleeding, refusing to quit even though his arms were shaking with exhaustion. The kid had heart, no question about that, but heart wasn't always enough. Sometimes heart just meant you suffered longer before you broke. Kowalski, Decker's voice carried over the rain. You planning to finish that climb today, or should we schedule it for next week? Danny pulled himself up another foot, his face a mask of determination and pain. The rope was slick with rain and probably blood from previous climbers. Every inch gained was a victory against gravity and exhaustion and the voice in your head that whispered about quitting. Jack moved closer, close enough that only Danny could hear. Use your legs more. Wrap the rope, push with your feet, save your arms. Danny glanced down, adjusted his technique, and suddenly the climb became easier. Not easy, nothing about this was easy, but possible. He reached the top, rang the bell, descended with control instead of desperation. When he reached the ground, breathing hard, he met Jack's eyes. Thanks, Sergeant. Don't thank me. You did the work. I just reminded you how. But that small moment of help, that tiny act of mentorship, established something between them. A connection that Jack knew was dangerous because connections meant vulnerability, meant caring about outcomes instead of just documenting them. But he'd never been good at staying detached. That was probably why he'd lasted 40 years in this work, or why he should have quit 30 years ago. The afternoon brought classroom instruction, tactical doctrine, the theoretical foundation for the practical skills they'd been drilling. Jack sat in the back of the room, ostensibly there to assist, but really there to observe. Decker taught the class, and what he taught was current, specific, detailed. These weren't outdated tactics from some dusty manual. This was doctrine refined through 20 years of urban combat, lessons bought with American blood in Fallujah and Ramadi and Kandahar. Watch how they stack on this door. Decker pointed to a diagram on the screen. Number 1 man posts security, 2 and 3 prepare for entry, 4 covers the fatal funnel. This formation saved lives in Iraq. Saved my life more than once. But it only works if everyone knows their role, executes without hesitation, trusts their brothers to do their part. The trainees took notes, absorbed the information, not knowing that somewhere in China, MSS analysts were studying the same doctrine, preparing their soldiers to counter American tactics using American knowledge, not knowing that the man teaching them might be the same man selling their future to the enemy. Jack photographed the slides with his encrypted phone, careful angles that looked like he was checking messages instead of gathering evidence. Each image would be analyzed by DI compared to known Chinese military training materials, building the case piece by piece. But photographs weren't enough. They needed proof of transmission, proof of payment, proof that would hold up in a court-martial. After class, Jack approached Decker with a question that was designed to probe without revealing. Master Sergeant, that urban entry technique you showed, that's updated from the manual I learned. Where'd that modification come from? Decker looked at him with those cold operator eyes. Fallujah, '06. We were clearing an apartment complex, taking casualties from the fatal funnel. A lieutenant, can't remember his name, suggested posting number 1 outside instead of leading the entry. Changed everything. Casualties dropped by half. That's good tactical evolution. The kind of thing that should be in the updated training manuals. It is. Decker's voice carried an edge. For people with the right clearance. You got questions about where I get my information, Sergeant Mitchell? Just trying to learn, Master Sergeant. Make sure I'm teaching these kids the best techniques, not outdated doctrine. You let me worry about what's current and what's not. Decker stepped closer, invading space in a way that was calculated to intimidate. You're here to assist, not to audit. We clear on that? Crystal. Jack held his ground, didn't step back, didn't show the discomfort that Decker was trying to provoke. But he filed away the interaction, another data point, another indication that Decker knew he was trafficking in sensitive material and was protective of questions about sources. That night, the incident happened that would change everything. Jack was in his quarters, filing his daily report, when he heard sounds from the direction of the trainee barracks. Not the usual sounds of soldiers settling in for the night. Something else. Something wrong. He moved toward the noise, muscle memory taking over. 40 years of responding to trouble before his conscious mind finished processing what he was hearing. The latrine was lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look stark and clinical. The sounds were clearer now. Impact, heavy breathing, someone trying not to scream. Jack entered and saw a scene that he'd witnessed variations of too many times in too many places. Tyler Jackson was on the floor, back against the shower wall, face already swelling from impacts. Decker stood over him, along with Staff Sergeant Luis Mendoza, the demolitions instructor that Jack had been watching with increasing suspicion. They weren't training. They weren't correcting deficiencies. They were beating a kid who couldn't fight back and enjoying it. You think you belong here? Decker's voice was calm, professional, like he was discussing equipment maintenance instead of assault. You think the Army needs soldiers who cry when the drill gets hard? Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. I didn't cry, Master Sergeant. I just asked for water. You asked like a bitch. Mendoza drove a kick into Tyler's ribs. In combat, the enemy doesn't give you water breaks. They give you bullets. We're teaching you what the real world looks like. Jack stood in the doorway, hand moving toward his forearm where the Omega Black sensor rested beneath his skin. 3 taps, and this would end. Delta would breach the doors within minutes. Decker and Mendoza would be in custody, Tyler would get medical attention, and the mission would be over. But ending the mission meant not catching Volkov, meant not identifying the full network, meant not stopping the intelligence leak that was feeding American tactics to Chinese analysts. One kid's suffering versus potentially hundreds of soldiers who might die when China invaded Taiwan using doctrine purchased from traders. The math was simple and horrible. Jack had learned to do that math a long time ago, but knowing how to calculate acceptable losses didn't make it hurt less when you chose to let the loss happen. He stepped into the latrine. Enough. Both instructors turned, and Jack saw the calculation in their eyes. Decker's hand moved toward his belt, where he wore a knife that probably wasn't authorized for training but was always present. Mendoza shifted his stance, combat ready, assessing whether Jack was a threat or just another instructor who'd learned to look the other way. This doesn't concern you, Mitchell. Decker's voice carried warning. This is correction training. Private Jackson here has attitude problems that need addressing. Jackson. Jack kept his voice level, betraying nothing of the rage that burned in his chest. Get up. Get to the aid station. Have them check those ribs. Tyler tried to stand, slipped on the wet tile, tried again. Jack moved to help him, and Decker's hand went to his knife. I said this doesn't concern you. Jack met his eyes, and for a moment the cover fell away. For a moment, Decker was looking at Colonel Jack Rearden, Special Forces, someone who'd done violence in dark places and wasn't intimidated by 2 instructors who thought they were hard because they beat on kids who couldn't fight back. I said it's enough. Jack's voice dropped to command tone, 40 years of authority compressed into 3 words. You want to discuss this, we can discuss it with Major Volkov. Otherwise, Jackson goes to the aid station, and we all forget this happened. The moment stretched, violence hanging in the air like static electricity. Then Mendoza laughed, breaking the tension. Relax, Decker. Mitchell's right. Kid's learned his lesson. We don't need paperwork over this. Decker's hand moved away from the knife. Yeah, Jackson, get out of here. You breathe a word of this to anyone, you'll wish we'd finished what we started. Tyler stumbled out, one arm wrapped around his ribs, not looking at Jack, not thanking him because thanks would acknowledge what had happened and make it real. Jack waited until the kid was gone, then turned back to the 2 instructors. That kind of correction training, Jack said carefully, that's approved by Major Volkov? Everything we do here is approved by the Major. Decker smiled, no warmth in it. He understands what it takes to build real soldiers. Not everyone does. Some people, they get soft, start thinking that kindness makes better warriors than hardship. But you're not like that, are you, Mitchell? You understand necessary. I understand necessary when it serves a purpose. Jack chose his words carefully. That looked more like entertainment than instruction. Entertainment. Mendoza laughed again. That's funny. No, Sergeant Mitchell, that was object lesson. These kids need to learn that the world is cruel, that enemies don't follow rules, that survival means being harder than whatever's trying to kill you. We provide that education. And if you have a problem with our methods, well, maybe you should discuss it with the major yourself. Maybe I will. You do that. Decker moved toward the door, stopped next to Jack. And Mitchell, word of advice. This base, these training companies, they run a certain way, have been running that way for over a year now. No problems, good results, command's happy. New instructors, sometimes they don't understand the culture, don't fit in. Those instructors, they usually don't last long. Requests for transfer get approved real quick. Just something to think about. They left, and Jack stood alone in the latrine that still smelled of violence and fear. He'd made a choice. He'd intervened enough to establish Tom Mitchell as someone with a conscience, someone who drew lines, but not so much that he'd blown his cover or triggered Omega Black. He'd calculated the balance, maintained the mission, and a kid named Tyler Jackson had paid the price for that calculation. Jack pulled out his encrypted phone, hands shaking for the first time in decades. Witnessed assault on Private Jackson by Decker and Mendoza, intervened to prevent serious injury but maintained cover. Jackson will not report incident due to fear of retaliation. Recommend immediate action. The response took longer than usual, 20 minutes that felt like hours. Finally, Walsh's message appeared on the screen. Recommendation denied. Intervention noted and approved to maintain cover credibility. Arresting Decker and Mendoza now would alert Volkov and compromise network identification. The mission is bigger than one trainee. Continue observation. Document everything. I know this is hard, Jack, but you know what's at stake. Jack deleted the messages, sat on the edge of the toilet, and allowed himself 5 minutes of honest emotion. Rage at a system that protected abusers. Rage at himself for being part of that system. Rage at the math that said Tyler Jackson's suffering was acceptable if it prevented future suffering. Rage at 40 years of making these calculations and still not being numb to them. After 5 minutes, he stood, washed his face, and became Tom Mitchell again. Because that was the job. Because someone had to do it. Because rage without discipline was just noise. The next morning, Tyler Jackson was in formation, moving carefully, protecting his ribs. Their eyes met briefly, and Jack saw something there that might have been gratitude or might have been betrayal. The kid knew Jack had helped, but also knew Jack hadn't helped enough. That Jack had walked away and let the system continue. Danny Kowalski noticed. The kid was observant, picked up on details that others missed. He approached Jack after PT, voice low. Sergeant Mitchell, Jackson's hurt. Real hurt, not training hurt. You know anything about that? I know he should see the medic. He says he fell in the shower. Danny's eyes said he knew that was a lie. But maybe if someone who wasn't scared talked to command, maybe something would change. Maybe. Jack met his gaze. Or maybe someone who talked to command would just make it worse for Jackson. Sometimes the best way to help is to keep your head down and survive. My dad used to say that too. When the factory management was cutting corners, ignoring safety rules, he kept his head down, survived 30 years, and it killed him anyway. Lung disease from chemicals they knew were dangerous but were cheaper than safe alternatives. Danny's jaw tightened. Keeping your head down doesn't stop the poison. It just means you die quiet. Your dad sounds like he was a good man caught in a bad situation. He was. And I'm not making the same mistakes he did. If something's wrong, you fight it, even if fighting costs you. Jack watched Danny walk away and felt something twist in his chest that might have been pride or might have been dread. Because the kid was right, morally right, but being morally right in an immoral system just meant you suffered more. And Jack was about to ask Danny to suffer in ways that the kid couldn't imagine yet. That afternoon, Volkov summoned Jack to his office. The command came through official channels, a scheduled meeting, nothing that would raise suspicions. But Jack felt the weight of it anyway. 3 weeks into the operation, maintaining cover under increasing scrutiny, knowing that Volkov was testing him with every interaction. The major's office looked the same as it had during their first meeting. But Volkov himself looked different. more relaxed, more confident, like he'd made some decision and was comfortable with whatever consequences it carried. Sergeant Mitchell, have a seat. Volkov gestured to a chair, then closed the door. A closed-door meeting between a major and a sergeant first class wasn't unusual, but it shifted the dynamic, made the space more intimate, more honest. I wanted to check in. You've been here 3 weeks now. How are you finding Fort Campbell? The training's solid, sir. Decker runs a tight program. The trainees are responding well to the pressure. Most of them. Volkov opened a file on his desk. We've had some incidents. Private Jackson, injuries sustained in a fall. Private Kowalski, defiant attitude toward instruction. These things concern me, Sergeant Mitchell, because they suggest that perhaps our methods aren't universally effective. No training method is universal, sir. Some soldiers respond to pressure by getting harder. Others just break. And which type are you? Volkov's question came sharp, direct. When you were younger, when you were going through selection, through the training that made you special forces, did the pressure make you harder or did you just survive it? Both, Jack answered honestly, because lies this close to truth were always more believable. I got harder in some ways, got broken in others. Came out different than I went in. Whether that's better or worse depends on what you value. What I value, Volkov stood, moved to the window, is soldiers who understand that the world is brutal, that survival requires brutality in return, that kindness is a luxury we can't afford. He turned back. I've been watching you, Sergeant Mitchell. The way you intervened last night with Decker and Jackson, the way you helped Kowalski with small technical corrections. You're competent, experienced, but you're also soft in ways that concern me. Soft. Jack kept his voice neutral. That's not a word many people have used to describe me, sir. Not soft in ability, soft in philosophy. You still believe that there's a right way to do this, a moral way to build warriors. But what if I told you that morality is a handicap? That the only way to prepare these kids for what's coming is to strip away every civilized instinct, every hesitation, every belief that there are rules that can't be broken? I'd say that's a dark worldview, sir. It's a realistic worldview. Volkov returned to his desk, pulled out a bottle of whiskey, poured 2 glasses. Do you know why I asked you here, Sergeant Mitchell? Not for a performance review, for an offer. He slid 1 glass across the desk to Jack. An offer to see things clearly, to understand that the system we serve is broken, that the wars we fought were lost before they started, that the only rational response to that reality is to salvage what we can from the wreckage. Jack didn't touch the whiskey. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. You understand. I can see it in your eyes. You're intelligent enough to have had the same thoughts I've had, that 20 years in Afghanistan accomplished nothing, that every tactical innovation, every lesson learned, every soldier who died teaching us how to fight, it was all wasted because politicians threw it away. Volkov drank his whiskey in 1 swallow. I'm offering you a chance to make it matter, to ensure that what we learned, what we paid for in blood, doesn't die with America's failures. Jack felt ice water in his veins. This was it, the recruitment pitch, the moment that would define whether his cover held or broke. How do I make it matter, sir? By recognizing that doctrine doesn't care what flag it serves under, that tactics are tools, and tools should be used by whoever will use them most effectively. Volkov poured another glass. I have connections, Sergeant Mitchell, connections to people who value American military experience, who are willing to pay substantial sums for detailed tactical knowledge. People who will use that knowledge to build an empire while America crumbles. You're talking about selling classified information. Jack said it flat, without judgment, the way Tom Mitchell would say it. A burned-out NCO hearing something that should shock him, but didn't because he'd lost the capacity for shock years ago. I'm talking about being compensated for knowledge that America is too weak to use properly. Volkov leaned forward. In the past 18 months, I've provided tactical assessments, training methodologies, operational procedures to interested parties. I've been paid over $2 million, and the doctrine I provided will be used to win wars while America loses them. Tell me, Sergeant Mitchell, which is more moral, letting knowledge die with a failed empire, or preserving it with powers that have the will to succeed? The $2 million, the 18 months, the directed mission. Jack's encrypted phone in his pocket was recording everything. Had been recording since he'd entered the office. This was the evidence that would hold up in court-martial. This was what Walsh needed. But Jack couldn't arrest Volkov. Not yet. Because Volkov had said connections, plural, because there was still Li Wei, the Chinese handler. Because shutting down one trader without exposing the full network just meant the network would adapt, would find new sources, would continue bleeding American secrets. So Jack sat in that office, looked at a traitor who'd just confessed, and said the words that would damn his soul a little more. How do I get involved? Volkov smiled, genuine warmth for the first time since Jack had met him. I knew you'd understand. I knew beneath that Boy Scout exterior, there was someone who'd made the same calculations I have. He pulled a laptop from his desk drawer. Here's what I need. Detailed after-action reviews from your time in special operations. Specific tactics, operational procedures, the classified material that made you effective. Document it, and I'll pay you $50,000 for the first package. After that, we negotiate based on value. Jack looked at the laptop, felt the weight of the choice. Taking it meant deeper cover, meant more time to identify the network, meant more evidence. But it also meant actually providing classified material, meant crossing a line from observer to participant, meant becoming the thing he was hunting. I need time to think about this, sir. Of course. Volkov's smile didn't fade. But not too much time. My buyers are impatient, and opportunities don't last forever. You have 48 hours to decide, Sergeant Mitchell. Are you with us, or are you just another soldier too afraid to seize what he's earned? Jack stood, left the office without touching the whiskey, and walked out into afternoon sun that felt too bright after the darkness of that conversation. He had 48 hours to decide, 48 hours to plan, 48 hours before everything went to hell. That night, he filed the longest report of his career. Detailed transcription of Volkov's confession, analysis of the implications, request for guidance on whether to actually provide classified material or whether the admission was sufficient for arrest. Walsh's response came in the middle of the night. Do not provide actual classified information. Prepare false documentation that appears legitimate but contains no actionable intelligence. We need you to attend the meeting with buyers, need identification of the full network before we move. I know what I'm asking, Jack. I know the weight of it, but you're the only one who can finish this. Jack sat in the darkness, listening to Fort Campbell sleep, and thought about his father, about the choice at Chosin, about dying so others could live, and wondered if providing false classified information to traitors while wearing an American uniform was the same kind of choice or just a different kind of damnation. Over the next 3 days, Jack began the painstaking work of creating false documentation that would pass expert scrutiny. This wasn't simply writing fiction. This was constructing lies sophisticated enough to fool intelligence analysts who'd spent careers studying American military doctrine, who'd paid millions for genuine secrets, who'd know within minutes if something felt wrong. Day one, he started with operational frameworks. Real after-action reports from Special Forces operations followed specific formats, used particular terminology, included details that only someone who'd been there would know. Jack pulled from 35 years of actual experience, taking real operations and altering them just enough. Changed dates by weeks, locations by miles, enemy force compositions by percentages. The structure was authentic because it came from genuine reports he'd written decades ago. But the specifics were corrupted, subtly poisoned in ways that would make the tactics useless or even dangerous if anyone tried to employ them. He worked in his quarters with the door locked, encrypted phone within reach, a bottle of aspirin nearby for the headaches that came from hours of concentration. The documentation had to thread an impossible needle. Too obviously fake, and Volkov would see through it immediately. Too authentic, and he'd be providing actual classified information, crossing a line from cover to treason. The sweet spot was narrow and demanded absolute precision. Day two brought tactical assessments. This was where Jack's Special Forces expertise became critical. He documented infiltration techniques, but altered the approach angles that made them work. Described extraction procedures, but inverted the timing sequences that kept operators alive. Detailed force protection protocols, but embedded assumptions about enemy capabilities that were dangerously wrong. Each lie was wrapped in enough truth that it would feel authentic to someone who hadn't executed these operations under fire. But to anyone who tried to use them in actual combat, they'd be worse than useless. They'd be lethal. The technical challenge was immense. Chinese military analysts weren't stupid. They'd compare his documentation against known American doctrine, look for inconsistencies, test the logic of his recommendations. Jack had to anticipate their analysis, had to think 3 moves ahead, embedding his deceptions deep enough that surface-level scrutiny wouldn't catch them. Only when someone tried to operationalize the tactics would the flaws become apparent, and by then it would be too late. Day 3 was refinement and verification. Jack reviewed every page, checking for patterns that might reveal the deception. Too many alterations in one area would raise flags. Too obvious a flaw would expose the entire package. He varied his deceptions, mixed truth with fiction, in ratios that felt organic rather than constructed, added authentic details that only a genuine Special Forces operator would know, small touches that sold the legitimacy of the broader lies. His hands cramped from typing. His eyes burned from staring at the screen. His shoulder ached from the old Kandahar wound, stress-triggering inflammation and damaged tissue. But he pushed through because the documentation had to be perfect. Had to be something that would convince Volkov he was genuine, convince Lee Wei to pay for it, convince Walsh that he'd done everything possible to protect actual classified information while maintaining his cover. Danny Kowalski found him that evening, after training, looking exhausted and determined. "Sergeant Mitchell, I need to tell you something." Jack looked up from his work, careful to position his body so Danny couldn't see the laptop screen. "What's on your mind, Private?" "I've been watching. The way Decker treats Jackson and some of the others. The way Mendoza teaches demolitions. Like he's preparing us for war crimes instead of combat. Something's wrong here. Something bigger than just harsh training." "Training's always harsh, Kowalski. That's the nature of the military. This is different." Danny sat down uninvited, voice urgent. "My dad worked in that factory for 30 years. Watched management cut corners. Watched safety standards slip. Watched good men get hurt. And everyone said it was just the nature of industrial work, that accidents happen. But it wasn't accidents. It was choices. People choosing profit over safety. And I see the same thing here, people choosing something over the welfare of the soldiers they're supposed to be training." Jack studied the kid, saw the intelligence behind the determination. Danny was putting pieces together, seeing patterns that he didn't fully understand but recognized as wrong. And in 48 hours, Jack was going to meet with Volkov's buyers, was going to pretend to sell American secrets. And if Danny kept digging, kept asking questions, he might stumble into something that would get him killed. "Private Kowalski, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it. Whatever you think is happening, whatever patterns you're seeing, the best thing you can do is nothing. Keep your head down, finish training, move on to your next assignment. Don't try to be a hero." "But if something's wrong, shouldn't someone stop it?" "Someone is." Jack said it without thinking, then realized he'd said too much. But Danny's eyes showed understanding, showed relief. "You're investigating. That's why you're really here." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Danny stood, looked at Jack with something like hope. "Whatever you're doing, however I can help, I will. My dad kept his head down and it killed him. I won't make the same mistake. The best way to help is to stay out of it, to trust that the system eventually will work." "Does it?" Danny's question carried 40 years of doubt compressed into 2 words. "Does the system work, Sergeant Mitchell? Or does it just grind up people who believe in it?" Jack had no answer for that. Had spent 40 years trying to make the system work, trying to be the person who fixed what was broken, and all he'd accomplished was accumulating bodies and regrets. But he couldn't tell a 19-year-old kid that the system might be irredeemable, couldn't steal his hope the way Jack's had been stolen piece by piece over decades of service. The system works when good people make it work. It's not perfect. It's never been perfect. But it's what we have, and abandoning it means chaos. So yeah, Private Kowalski, I believe the system can work. I have to believe that. Because if I don't, then everything I've done for 40 years was for nothing. Danny nodded, accepted this, and left Jack alone with his lies and his laptop and his father's photograph staring at him from the desk. The 48 hours passed like a countdown to execution. Jack finished the false documentation, encrypted it, prepared to hand over what looked like American secrets, but was actually carefully constructed fiction. He rehearsed his cover story, his motivation, the burned-out NCO who'd realized that patriotism was for suckers and decided to get paid. He met with Volkov on schedule in the major's office after duty hours. "I've thought about your offer, sir. I'm in." Volkov's smile was genuine. "I knew you would be. You're too smart to stay loyal to a country that abandoned us." He took the encrypted drive that Jack offered. "This is the documentation? After action reports from 3 operations, tactical assessments, detailed procedures for infiltration, target acquisition, extraction under fire. Everything you asked for." Volkov plugged the drive into his laptop, began reviewing files. His eyes widened slightly as he read, and Jack felt a moment of fear that the deception had been too obvious, that Volkov would see through it. But then the major nodded. "This is excellent, detailed, specific, exactly what my buyers want." He closed the laptop. "There's a meeting tomorrow night, warehouse outside Fort Campbell. You'll come with me, meet the people who are paying for this. They'll want to verify you're legitimate, that this isn't some elaborate sting operation. And if they're not convinced, then we all have a problem." Volkov's voice carried an edge. "But you'll convince them, Sergeant Mitchell, because you're as tired of serving a dying empire as I am. Because you've seen what I've seen and reached the same conclusions. Because you're smart enough to know that the winning side is the side that pays." Jack nodded, committed to the path, knowing that tomorrow night would either expose the entire network or get him killed. Knowing that he was deeper into this operation than he'd ever been in any mission, that he was dancing on a razor's edge between success and catastrophe. He spent that final evening writing a letter that would be found if he didn't come back. Not a formal report, a personal letter to Danny Kowalski, explaining what he'd been doing, why he'd done it, asking the kid not to make the same mistakes Jack had made, asking him to be better, to find a way to serve that didn't require selling pieces of your soul for the mission. He sealed the letter, left it in his desk where it would be found if Omega Black was triggered and Delta had to come retrieve his body. Then Jack Rearden, or Tom Mitchell, or whoever he was in the space between identities, checked his weapon, verified the Omega Black sensor was active, and prepared to walk into a warehouse full of traitors while pretending to be one of them. The photograph of his father watched from the desk, frozen in time before Chosin, before the choice, before the end. Jack whispered to that image one more time. "I hope you understand why I'm doing this. I hope somewhere, somehow, you know that I'm trying to honor what you died for. Even if the way I'm doing it would make you ashamed. Even if I'm becoming something you wouldn't recognize. I'm still fighting the same war you fought, just with different weapons, against different enemies, some of whom wear the same uniform I do." Tomorrow night would bring answers. Tomorrow night would bring either triumph or disaster. Tomorrow night, Jack would stand in a room with traitors and Chinese intelligence officers and pretend to be one of them while recording everything for a court-martial that might never happen because he might not survive to testify. But tonight, he was still Jack Rearden, still his father's son, still a soldier who believed, despite everything, that some things were worth fighting for, even if fighting for them required becoming the enemy. Even if the cost was everything he'd ever believed about himself. Even if, at the end, he couldn't tell the difference between the man he was and the man he was pretending to be. The night deepened, Fort Campbell fell quiet, and Jack closed his eyes knowing sleep wouldn't come, waiting for tomorrow and whatever judgment it would bring. The warehouse sat on the outskirts of Clarksville, 15 miles from Fort Campbell, surrounded by industrial buildings that had seen better decades. Jack arrived with Volkov in an unmarked sedan, the kind of anonymous vehicle that screamed federal operation to anyone trained to notice such things. But Volkov drove it casually, confident, like a man who'd done this route so many times that paranoia had given way to routine. The sun was setting, painting the Tennessee sky in colors that reminded Jack of burning oil fields in Kuwait, a lifetime ago when enemies were clear and Betrayal wore foreign uniforms. Now he was driving toward a meeting with traitors while pretending to be one, and the only thing burning was whatever remained of his conscience. "You're quiet." Volkov glanced at him as they turned onto the access road. "Nervous? Cautious." Jack kept his voice steady. "First time meeting foreign intelligence officers. Want to make sure I don't say something that gets us all arrested." Volkov laughed, genuine amusement. "You won't. Leeway is professional, sophisticated. He's been buying American intelligence for 5 years, knows how to run an operation without drawing attention. And Sergeant Mitchell, if you were undercover law enforcement, you'd have arrested me the moment I made the offer. The fact that you're here with documentation means you've already crossed the line. No going back now. Jack felt the weight of those words. Volkov was right about one thing. There was no going back. Whether this mission ended in arrests or body bags, Jack Rearden would never be the same man who'd stood at his father's grave 4 weeks ago and accepted this assignment. The warehouse was exactly what Jack had expected. Concrete and steel, high windows that were either broken or painted over, a loading dock that hadn't seen legitimate cargo in years. Two vehicles were already parked outside. One was a black SUV with diplomatic plates that would give its occupants immunity from local law enforcement. The other was a white panel van unmarked, the kind that could contain surveillance equipment or a cleanup crew. Jack's hand moved unconsciously toward his forearm, where the Omega Black sensor rested beneath his skin. 3 taps and Delta would be rolling within minutes. But not yet. He needed to see Li Wei, needed to record the exchange, needed evidence that would dismantle the entire network instead of just capturing one meeting's participants. They exited the sedan. Volkov moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. Jack moved with the careful awareness of someone walking into a trap while pretending not to notice the jaws closing. The warehouse interior was dimly lit, illuminated by work lights that cast harsh shadows and left pools of darkness where anything could be hiding. Jack's eyes adjusted quickly, cataloging exits, cover positions, potential threats. Old instincts, 40 years of training, assessing tactical situations before conscious thought caught up. 3 men waited in the center of the space. The first was Li Wei, and Jack recognized him from DIA briefings even though they'd never met. Mid-40s, expensive suit that looked wrong in this industrial wasteland. The kind of calm competence that came from years in intelligence work. He stood with the posture of someone who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. Flanking him were 2 younger men, 30s, athletic builds poorly concealed under casual American clothes. Security, definitely. Probably armed, certainly trained. Their eyes tracked Jack and Volkov with the professional assessment of people paid to identify threats. The third man surprised Jack. Not Chinese, not security. American, late 40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent time in the field. He wore jeans and a work jacket. Could have been a contractor or a trucker, but his eyes told a different story. Those were operator eyes, someone who'd seen combat and learned to live with it. Victor, Li Wei's English was perfect, no trace of accent. Welcome, and this must be your new associate, Sergeant First Class Tom Mitchell. Volkov gestured at Jack. 35 years Special Forces, exactly the kind of experience you've been asking for. Li Wei extended his hand. Jack shook it, feeling the soft skin of someone who'd never done manual labor, never held a rifle in combat, never bled for any cause beyond personal advancement. A pleasure, Sergeant Mitchell. Victor speaks highly of your credentials. He turned to the third man. This is my associate, Michael Chen. He'll be evaluating the technical accuracy of your documentation. Michael Chen. The name was obviously false, probably changed multiple times over a career spent in shadows. Jack nodded acknowledgement, recognizing a kindred spirit corrupted. This was what he might become if he stayed in this work too long. Someone who could justify anything, betray anyone, as long as the mission required it. The documentation. Li Wei gestured to a folding table set up in the warehouse center. Victor said you've prepared detailed after-action reports from classified operations. Jack pulled the encrypted drive from his pocket, feeling its weight like an anchor. This was the moment, handing over what Li Wei believed was genuine classified material, crossing the line from observer to active participant in espionage. Everything that came after this moment would be tainted by this choice, no matter how necessary Walsh claimed it was. 3 operations. Jack kept his voice flat, professional. Infiltration tactics, extraction procedures, detailed engagement protocols, everything you asked for. Li Wei took the drive, handed it to Michael Chen, who moved to a laptop set up on the table. The next few minutes would determine whether Jack's carefully constructed lies were sophisticated enough to fool intelligence analysts who'd spent years studying American military doctrine. Jack's encrypted phone was recording everything, had been recording since they had entered the warehouse. Audio, timestamps, GPS coordinates. Evidence that would destroy everyone in this room, but only if Jack survived to provide testimony. Only if Delta arrived before Li Wei's security decided that Tom Mitchell asked too many questions or showed too much competence. Chen worked in silence, opening files, reading with the focused intensity of someone who knew what to look for. Jack watched his face, trying to read the verdict before it was spoken. But Chen's expression revealed nothing. Professional inscrutability that matched Li Wei's calm. Volkov moved beside Jack, voice low. Relax, you look like you're waiting for an execution. Maybe I am. Jack let some honest fear into his voice. This is treason, Major. I understand the reasoning, agree with the philosophy, but this is still the moment where I become something I never thought I'd be. You became it the moment you accepted the offer. This is just formalization. Volkov smiled. And after tonight, you'll be wealthy enough not to care about philosophical distinctions. Chen looked up from the laptop, spoke in Mandarin to Li Wei. Jack didn't speak the language, but he recognized the tone. Assessment, evaluation, verdict. Everything hinged on whether the false documentation was convincing enough to pass expert analysis. Li Wei listened, nodded, turned back to Jack and Volkov. This is excellent work, Sergeant Mitchell. Detailed, specific, exactly what we need for our tactical training programs. Michael confirms the authenticity. Jack felt relief and horror in equal measure. Relief that the cover held. Horror that his lies were good enough to fool intelligence professionals, which meant other lies he'd told over 40 years might have been just as convincing, just as corrupting. Payment. Li Wei gestured to one of his security men who retrieved a briefcase from the SUV. $50,000, as agreed. He opened the case, revealing stacked bills that looked obscene in their casual abundance. Count it if you wish. I trust you. Jack said it because Tom Mitchell would, because a burned-out NCO getting paid for treason wouldn't insult his buyers by questioning their honesty. But his hand moved toward his forearm again, toward the Omega Black sensor, toward the decision that was coming faster than he'd anticipated. There's more work available. Li Wei closed the briefcase, set it at Jack's feet. Much more. We're particularly interested in force protection protocols, counter-surveillance techniques, anything related to protecting high-value targets. I'm prepared to pay $200,000 for comprehensive documentation in those areas. $200,000. Jack let the number hang in the air. For how much material? Everything you know. Li Wei's smile didn't reach his eyes. 35 years of Special Forces experience, Sergeant Mitchell. That knowledge is worth millions to us. We're offering $200,000 as a starting point. Prove your value and the compensation increases accordingly. This was it, the full pitch. The moment when Li Wei revealed the scope of his operation, the amount of money changing hands, the systematic purchase of American military secrets. Everything Jack needed for a conviction. Everything Walsh had sent him to obtain. His hand moved to his forearm. 3 taps. That was all it would take. But something stopped him. Some instinct that said the puzzle wasn't complete, that there was another piece still hidden. I'm interested. Jack forced himself to focus. But I need guarantees. Need to know this operation is secure, that I'm not going to end up in Leavenworth because someone got sloppy. The operation is absolutely secure. Volkov spoke before Li Wei could respond. We've been running it for 18 months, 0 problems. Complete operational security. Our protocols are airtight. Are they? The voice came from the darkness behind the table, from shadows that Jack had cataloged but not investigated because the visible threats had occupied his attention. A 4th man stepped into the light, and the temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. General Marcus Stone. But Stone wasn't looking at Jack with surprise. He was looking at him with the calm satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment, who'd orchestrated this confrontation down to the finest detail. Marcus, Volkov's voice carried genuine shock. What are you doing here? What I've been doing for 22 years, Victor. Stone moved closer, and Jack could see now that he held a tablet in one hand, pistol in the other. Running the most successful intelligence operation in modern history, selling American military doctrine to the highest bidder, and watching fools like you make exactly the mistakes I knew you'd make. He tapped the tablet screen, turned it to show surveillance footage. Jack recognized it immediately. Fort Campbell, the training grounds. Himself walking with Danny Kowalski. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. I've been watching you since you arrived, Jack. Stone's voice carried an edge of disappointment mixed with admiration. Oh, I knew who you were the moment your prince came back from that coffee mug. Jack Rearden, my former protege from Desert Storm, suddenly appearing at Fort Campbell under a paper-thin cover identity. I've had cameras on you, informants tracking you, full surveillance package from day one. He swiped to another image. Jack in his quarters, reviewing files on his laptop. Another swipe. Jack talking to Walsh on his encrypted phone. Another swipe. Jack placing the Omega Black sensor against his forearm in his bathroom, thinking he was alone. You were never undercover, Jack. You were always exposed. I just wanted to see how far you'd go, what you'd do, whether you still had the same naive belief in the system that made you such a predictable operator. Stone smiled without warmth. And you didn't disappoint. Still the Boy Scout. Still believing that following orders and keeping your oath made you righteous. Still thinking that men like me are aberrations instead of the logical conclusion of 40 years watching America fail. Then why let me get this far? Jack's voice was steady despite the ice water in his veins. Why not kill me the first week? Because I wanted you to see, to understand, to reach the point where you'd have to choose between your precious oath and the reality that your oath means nothing. Stone gestured at the warehouse, at leeway and the surveillance equipment and the evidence of 22 years of betrayal. Victor made his choice. He's sloppy, emotional, but he chose pragmatism over dogma. I wanted to give you the same opportunity to see if my best student had learned what I'd learned. That loyalty to a dying empire is just slow-motion suicide. The words hung in the warehouse like a death sentence. Leeway's security stepped forward, hands moving toward weapons. Volkov spun toward Jack, betrayal and understanding dawning across his face. And Jack knew that the next 60 seconds would determine whether he died in this warehouse or survived to face whatever came after. Marcus, Jack kept his voice steady, even as his fingers found the Omega Black sensor. I should have known. Should have known what? That your mentor was the traitor? That the man who taught you about honor and service was selling both for 22 years? Stone laughed, bitter sound. You should have known, Jack. You should have seen it. But you were too busy being the Boy Scout, too busy believing in the system to notice that the system was rotten from the top down. Why? The question came out raw, honest. Why betray everything you fought for? Because I fought for nothing. Stone's voice carried decades of disillusionment compressed into 4 words. Vietnam was a lie. The Gulf was oil company profit margins. Afghanistan was nation-building fantasy. Iraq was weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. I spent 44 years watching America lose wars it should have won, watching politicians waste the lives of better men than themselves, watching everything we accomplished get thrown away by people who never served a day in uniform. So you sold out. I got paid for what America was throwing away anyway. Stone gestured at leeway. The Chinese will use our doctrine properly. We'll study it, adapt it, employ it to win wars instead of losing them. I'm not betraying America, Jack. I'm salvaging value from its corpse. Jack's fingers pressed the Omega Black sensor once, twice. The third tap would activate the extraction, would bring Delta crashing through the walls. But Stone was still talking, still revealing details, and every second of recording was evidence that would be needed for the trials. You're wondering whether to trigger your panic button. Stone smiled. Yes, Jack, I know about Omega Black. I authorized the protocol. I know exactly what you're wearing, exactly what you're planning. And I'm telling you that if you make that third tap, everyone in this warehouse dies before Delta arrives. My security, Leeway's security, we're all professionals. We can kill you and disappear in under 90 seconds. So this is it. Jack kept his voice level. You're going to kill me, kill Volkov for being sloppy, and continue the operation. Not quite. Stone holstered his pistol, a gesture of confidence that was more intimidating than the weapon itself. I'm going to offer you the same choice I offered Victor. Join us. Really join us, or die here. Because Jack, you're 58 years old, spent 40 years serving a country that's failing. You've got what, 10 years left before your body completely breaks down? 10 years of living on a military pension that barely covers rent. Or you could have $2 million, retire to somewhere warm, spend your last decade comfortable instead of struggling. The offer sat between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Join the man who'd mentored him, embrace the betrayal, live out his remaining years in comfort purchased with treason. Or refuse, die here in this warehouse, become another casualty of a mission that had already cost too much. Jack thought about his father, about Khe-Sanh, about the choice to die rather than retreat, to sacrifice self for others, to believe that some things were worth more than survival. He thought about Danny Kowalski, 19 years old, still believing the system could be fixed if good people fought for it. He thought about Tyler Jackson, beaten in a shower, suffering because Jack had calculated that documenting abuse was more important than stopping it. He thought about 40 years of choices, 40 years of missions, 40 years of becoming something less than what he'd intended so that someone else could become something more. And Jack Rearden, Colonel, United States Army, made his choice. No, the word echoed in the warehouse, simple and absolute. Stone's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been respect or might have been disappointment. No, that's it? No explanation, no negotiation? My father died at Chosin rather than retreat. Jack's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of 40 years. He was 28 years old, had everything to live for, chose to die so his men could escape. I'm 58, got nothing left but a bummed shoulder and a lifetime of regrets. If he could make that choice at 28, I can make it at 58. Noble. Stone pulled his pistol again. And stupid. Your father died for nothing, Jack. Chosin fell anyway. The war was lost anyway. His sacrifice was meaningless gesture, and you're about to repeat it. Maybe. Jack's finger moved to the Omega Black sensor, preparing for the third tap. But gestures are all we have, and I'd rather die making the right gesture than live having made the wrong one. He pressed the sensor 3 times. For a moment, nothing happened. For a moment, Jack wondered if Stone had somehow disabled the device, if the extraction call was falling into digital void, if he just committed suicide by dramatic declaration. Then the warehouse lights died, plunging everything into darkness, broken only by emergency exit signs that cast red illumination like pools of blood. Jack moved on instinct, 40 years of combat experience taking over. He dropped, rolled left, came up behind cover that had been a pallet of old equipment. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes strobing the darkness, rounds sparking off concrete and steel. Someone screamed. Someone else was shouting in Mandarin. Volkov's voice cut through the case, calling for ceasefire, calling for lights, calling for control that nobody had. Jack's hand found his weapon, his old service pistol that he'd carried for 30 years and hoped he'd never have to fire again. The grip felt familiar, comfortable, like shaking hands with an old friend who'd seen you through hell and never asked questions about what happened there. He stayed behind cover, controlling his breathing, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. The shooting had stopped, replaced by the sounds of people moving, repositioning, preparing for whatever came next. Then the wall exploded, not figuratively, literally. Breaching charges blew out a section of the warehouse wall, and suddenly the darkness was filled with light and smoke, and the kind of violence that only came from America's most elite operators executing a hostage rescue. Delta, black-clad, night vision equipped, moving with the synchronized precision that came from thousands of hours of training. They swept through the warehouse like a force of nature, voices amplified through speakers calling out commands that allowed no discussion. Get down, hands visible, do not move. Jack stayed behind his cover, hands visible, letting them see he wasn't a threat. The last thing he needed was to survive betrayal and assassination, only to be shot by the rescue team because someone misidentified him in the chaos. The lights came back on, harsh and sudden, revealing a scene that looked like the aftermath of battle. Leeway security were on the ground, zip-tied, one of them bleeding from a leg wound. Volkov was against the wall, hands behind his head, face showing shock and understanding. Leeway himself stood calmly, almost bored, already calculating which diplomatic immunity claims would protect him. And Stone. General Marcus Stone stood in the center of the warehouse, pistol on the ground at his feet, hands raised, wearing an expression that combined defeat and relief in equal measure. A Delta operator approached Jack, weapon ready but not aimed. Identify yourself. Colonel Jack Rearden, DIA. Jack kept his hands visible. Omega Black activation, operation codename Iron Gate. The operator spoke into his radio, confirming Jack's identity, receiving authorization to stand down. Copy that. He lowered his weapon. Sir, are you injured? No. Jack stood, his body protesting the sudden movement, adrenaline fading to reveal all the aches and pains of a 58-year-old man who just survived a gunfight. But I need you to secure a white panel van outside. May contain additional suspects or equipment. Already secured, sir. The operator gestured toward the blown-out wall where more Delta operators were processing the scene. We had visual on all vehicles when we breached. Jack moved towards Stone, each step feeling like walking through water. His mentor, his friend, the man who'd taught him what it meant to be a soldier, stood there in zip ties and shame. Marcus, Jack's voice was quiet enough that only Stone could hear. Why did you tell me? You could have just killed me, could have maintained your cover. Why reveal yourself? Because I wanted you to know. Stone met his eyes, and for a moment, Jack saw the officer from Desert Storm, the leader he had respected, before the betrayal corrupted the memory. Wanted you to understand that I'm not a monster, just a realist. That everything I did with open eyes and clear conscience. I don't feel guilty, Jack. I feel vindicated. And I wanted you to know that before you destroyed me. You destroyed yourself. Jack turned away, couldn't look at him anymore. I just documented it. Raymond Walsh arrived 30 minutes later, moving faster than a 65-year-old man with a cane should move, followed by a small army of DIA agents and military police. The warehouse had become a crime scene, photographers documenting everything, evidence being collected and cataloged, suspects being separated and prepared for transport. Walsh found Jack sitting on a concrete block outside, watching the sunrise paint the Tennessee sky in colors that reminded him of too many mornings in too many war zones. You did it. Walsh's voice carried satisfaction and exhaustion in equal measure. 22 years, Jack. Stone ran this network for 22 years, and you broke it in 4 weeks. Didn't break it. Jack didn't look at him, just exposed it. The network's still out there, all the people Stone sold to, all the foreign intelligence services that have our doctrine. Breaking it would mean undoing 22 years of damage. I just arrested the people responsible, which is more than anyone else accomplished. Walsh sat down beside him, moving carefully. I know what this cost you. I know Marcus was your mentor, your friend. I'm sorry you had to be the one to take him down. Someone had to. Jack finally looked at Walsh, saw the old spy evaluating him, trying to determine if this mission had broken something that couldn't be fixed. And it should have been someone who remembered what he used to be. For he became this, someone who could testify about the man he betrayed, not just the crimes he committed. They sat in silence, watching the sun climb higher, watching the crime scene processors work, watching military police load General Marcus Stone into a transport vehicle that would take him to a holding cell and then to a court-martial that would define the word treason for a new generation. Jack, Walsh's voice was careful, probing, are you okay? Really okay? Because what you just went through, what you just survived, that's trauma on top of trauma. We have counselors, resources, support systems. I'm fine. Jack stood, filling every one of his 58 years. I'll file my reports, testify at the trials, make sure everyone involved gets what they deserve. After that, I'm done, Ray. 40 years is enough. Time to retire for real. I understand, but Jack, before you decide anything, there's someone who wants to see you. Walsh gestured toward a Humvee that had just arrived, from which Danny Kowalski was emerging. Still in trainee uniform, looking confused and determined and very young. The kid had questions, deserved answers. And Jack owed him those answers, even if they weren't the inspiring story of justice triumphant that 19-year-olds needed to believe in. Sergeant Mitchell. Danny approached, stopped when he saw Jack's face, the blood on his shirt, the exhaustion in his eyes. Or should I say Colonel Rearden? They told me who you really are, told me what you were doing, why you were really at Fort Campbell. What did they tell you? Jack kept his voice neutral. That you were investigating corruption? That you stopped a spring? That you're a hero. Danny studied him. But you don't look like a hero. You look like someone who just survived something that heroes shouldn't have to survive. Perceptive kid. Jack allowed himself a small smile. You're going to make a good soldier, Kowalski. You see things that others miss. Is it true about General Stone, about him running this for 22 years? It's true. And about Major Volkov and Decker and Mendoza and all the others. The whole thing was rotten, Danny. The whole system you believed in, that your dad wanted you to serve, it was compromised from the top. But you fixed it. Danny's voice carried the desperate need to believe. You exposed them, arrested them, made it right. I arrested them. Jack met his eyes, decided the kid deserved truth instead of comfort. But I didn't make it right. The damage they did over 22 years, that can't be undone. The doctrine they sold, the soldiers who will die because enemies studied our tactics, that's permanent. I didn't fix anything, Danny. I just stopped it from getting worse. That's something. That's what good people do. They see what's wrong and they stop it, even when stopping it costs them everything. Danny extended his hand. Thank you, Colonel Rearden, for being who my dad wanted me to become. Jack shook his hand, felt the strength in the kid's grip, the conviction that hadn't been corrupted yet. Maybe Danny would keep that conviction. Maybe he'd lose it the way Stone had lost it, the way Jack had lost pieces of it over 40 years. But right now, in this moment, he still believed. And that belief was worth protecting, even if Jack no longer shared it. Take care of yourself, Private Kowalski. Stay hard, stay honest, and don't let this place turn you into something you're not. I won't. Danny saluted, crisp and perfect, the way soldiers saluted when they meant it. I promise. He walked away, and Jack watched him go, wondering if promises made at 19 meant anything by the time you reach 58. Wondering if the kid would look back at this conversation 20 years from now and realize that Jack had lied to him one more time by pretending that staying honest was possible in a system built on compromises. Walsh approached again, had been standing at a discreet distance while Jack talked to Danny. What now? Now I go back to Fort Campbell, file paperwork, debrief every agency that wants a piece of this, and try to figure out how to testify against a man I once trusted with my life. And after that, I'm done. Jack looked at the sunrise, at the light spreading across Tennessee countryside that his father had fought to protect in a different war, in a different time. 40 years of this is enough. Time to find out if there's anything left of Jack Rearden under all the cover identities and mission parameters and acceptable losses. He's still there. Walsh's voice carried certainty, battered, worn down, but still there. I've known you 35 years, Jack. You're the most honest liar I ever met. You hate every deception, every compromise, every line you have to cross. That's what makes you good at this, and that's what's kept you human. Maybe. Jack turned to leave to begin the long process of becoming himself again after 4 weeks of being Tom Mitchell. But if I'm still human, why does everything I touch turn to ash? He walked away without waiting for an answer because there wasn't one. There was just the mission, complete but not finished, successful but not victorious, ended but never really over. Behind him, the warehouse stood with its blown-out wall and crime scene tape and evidence of betrayal that spanned 2 decades. Inside, American secrets had been sold by Americans to enemies who would use them to kill Americans. And Jack had stopped it, arrested the traitors, brought them to justice. But justice didn't undo the damage, didn't bring back the soldiers who died because enemies had purchased their tactics, didn't restore the trust that had been shattered when a mentor revealed himself as traitor, didn't make 40 years of compromise and moral injury suddenly worthwhile. Jack walked toward the future, whatever that meant for a 58-year-old man who'd spent his life becoming other people and wasn't sure who he was when the masks came off. The sun climbed higher. Fort Campbell waited. And somewhere his father's grave in Arlington held a bronze star with a V device that Jack had promised to return with a story of choices made and prices paid. He hoped the story would be enough. Hoped that somewhere, somehow, the old man was watching and understood why his son had done what he'd done, even if the how was harder to justify. But hope was all he had left. That and the weight of 40 years, and the knowledge that some battles were won by surviving them, not by emerging victorious. Jack kept walking. The military courtroom at Fort Leavenworth sat like judgment itself, all dark wood and American flags and the weight of 2 centuries of military justice pressing down on everyone who entered. Jack had been in courtrooms before, had testified in dozens of cases over 40 years, but never like this. Never against a man who'd taught him what it meant to be a soldier. Never with this much at stake. General Marcus Stone sat at the defense table in dress uniform, stripped of rank insignia and decorations, but still carrying himself with the bearing of someone who'd commanded men in combat. His attorney was civilian, expensive, the kind of lawyer who specialized in impossible cases and took them anyway because the challenge mattered more than the outcome. Behind Stone, the gallery was packed with reporters, senior officers, and relatives of soldiers who died in operations potentially compromised by 22 years of sold secrets. Jack sat in the witness section waiting to be called, watching the proceedings with the detached focus that came from knowing his testimony would either seal Stone's fate or create reasonable doubt that might save him. 6 weeks had passed since the warehouse. 6 weeks of debriefings and depositions, and nights when he woke up at 3 in the morning, wondering if he'd done the right thing or just the necessary thing, and whether there was still a difference. The prosecutor was Colonel Jennifer Hayes, a career JAG officer with a reputation for being thorough and merciless. She stood before the panel of senior officers who would determine Stone's guilt, and her voice carried the weight of institutional betrayal. Members of the panel, you will hear evidence that General Marcus Stone, over a period of 22 years, systematically sold classified United States military doctrine to Chinese intelligence services. You will hear that he received over $10 million in payments. You will hear that his actions directly contributed to enemy capabilities that have cost American lives and will continue to cost American lives when China employs these tactics in future conflicts. Stone's attorney, a silver-haired man named Richard Morrison, rose for his opening statement. The defense will show that General Stone acted not out of greed, but out of genuine belief that American military doctrine was being wasted by failed policies and corrupt leadership. We will demonstrate that his actions, while technically illegal, were motivated by the same love of country that drove him through 44 years of honorable service. Jack listened to both sides frame their narratives, knowing that the truth was more complicated than either version. Stone wasn't a mustache-twirling villain who betrayed for money, but he also wasn't a misunderstood patriot trying to salvage value from American failures. He was something harder to categorize. A man who'd started with legitimate grievances and let them metastasize into justification for betrayal. The prosecution spent 3 days building their case. Financial records showing offshore accounts. Testimony from Li Wei, who'd been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation. Documentation of tactical manuals and training protocols that had appeared in Chinese military exercises. A paper trail that connected Stone to every dollar, every document, every act of treason over 2 decades. Then it was Jack's turn. Colonel Rearden, please state your relationship with the defendant. Jack stood in the witness box, hands still on the Bible from his oath, looking at Stone for the first time since the warehouse. General Stone was my mentor. We served together in Desert Storm. He recommended me for promotion, wrote letters of recommendation for assignments, was someone I trusted completely. And what was your role in the investigation that led to General Stone's arrest? I was an undercover operative, posing as an instructor at Fort Campbell. My mission was to identify and document aspiring selling classified doctrine to Chinese intelligence. Did you suspect General Stone was involved? No. Jack's voice carried the weight of that admission. I believed he was providing operational support for my mission. When he revealed himself at the warehouse, it was the first time I knew he was the architect of the network I'd been sent to expose. Tell us about that moment. The prosecution wanted the dramatic reveal, wanted the panel to feel the betrayal. Jack looked at Stone, saw him watching without expression, and began to recount that night. The warehouse, the meeting with Li Wei, Volkov's shock when Stone emerged from the shadows. Every detail was recorded in his official report, but speaking it aloud made it real in a way that written words couldn't capture. General Stone told me he'd been running this operation for 22 years. He offered me $2 million to join him. When I refused, he drew his weapon and would have killed me if I hadn't activated my extraction protocol. Why did you refuse? Morrison jumped on this during cross-examination. You'd already crossed numerous lines in your undercover role. You'd witnessed abuse and not immediately reported it. You'd prepared false classified documents to maintain your cover. Why draw the line at accepting General Stone's offer? Because everything else I did was in service of stopping the betrayal. Accepting his offer would have been participating in it. There's a difference between necessary deception and actual treason. Is there? Morrison moved closer, sensing weakness. Or is the difference just what we tell ourselves to sleep at night? You violated regulations, lied to good soldiers, documented suffering you could have stopped. General Stone did the same things, just on a larger scale. What makes your choices noble and his choices criminal? The question hung in the courtroom, and Jack felt the weight of it, felt 40 years of compromises and moral injuries pressing down, demanding an answer that would justify every choice he'd made. Intent. Jack's voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. I did what I did to stop betrayal. General Stone did what he did to profit from it. That's the difference, not the actions, but the purpose behind them. Purpose. Morrison smiled, knowing he'd struck something. General Stone believed American doctrine was being wasted, that selling it to powers who would use it properly was better than letting it die with American failures. That was his purpose. Who are you to judge that his purpose was less valid than yours? Jack looked at Stone again. saw the man watching him with something that might have been pride or might have been sadness. And for a moment, Jack wondered if Morrison was right, if the difference between them was really just perspective, just whose version of patriotism you believed. But then he thought about Danny Kowalski, 19 years old, still believing the system could work. Thought about Tyler Jackson, beaten in a shower while Jack documented instead of stopped. Thought about his father at Chosin, choosing to die so others could live, never questioning whether the cause was worth the sacrifice. I judge because someone has to. Jack met Morrison's eyes. We can debate philosophy, debate whether America deserves the loyalty we give it, debate whether the system is worth preserving. But at the end of the day, you either keep your oath or you break it. General Stone broke his. I kept mine. That's the only difference that matters. The questioning continued for hours, prosecution and defense both trying to shape Jack's testimony into support for their narratives. But through it all, Jack stuck to the facts. What he'd seen, what he'd documented, what had happened in that warehouse when Stone revealed himself. When it was over, when he'd been dismissed from the stand, Jack walked out of the courtroom and found Danny Kowalski waiting in the hallway. The kid had been granted leave to attend the trial, had driven from Fort Campbell, where he was now in advanced infantry training. Colonel, Danny stood when Jack approached. That was something in there, the way you held up under cross-examination. I don't know how you stayed calm. Practice. Jack sat down on a bench, suddenly exhausted. 40 years of testifying teaches you to separate emotion from facts, to say what needs saying without letting it touch you. Does it work? Separating emotion from facts? Sometimes. Jack looked at the closed courtroom doors. Other times the emotion finds you later, in the middle of the night, when you're not expecting it. They sat in silence for a moment, two soldiers at different stages of the same journey, both trying to make sense of how men they respected could do things that betrayed everything they were supposed to represent. Colonel Rearden, can I ask you something? Danny's voice was careful. When you were my age, did you ever think you'd end up here, testifying against your mentor, watching heroes become traitors? No. When I was your age, I thought the world was simpler. Good guys, bad guys, clear missions. But the older you get, the more you realize that the line between those categories is thinner than you want it to be. And sometimes people you love end up on the wrong side of it. How do you live with that? Jack thought about the question. About 40 years of living with compromises and moral injuries and the weight of choices made in the space between right and wrong. You remember why you made the choices you made. You hold on to the belief that even if the choices were hard, they were necessary. And you hope that when your time comes, the balance sheet shows you did more good than harm. That's all any of us can do. Danny nodded, processing this. Thanks for being honest. Most officers, they give you the party line, tell you everything makes sense if you just trust the system. But you tell the truth, even when it's ugly. The truth is all I have left. Jack stood, preparing to leave. Everything else is just performance. The trial lasted 2 more weeks. Volkov testified, trying to minimize his own role by emphasizing Stone's control over the operation. Decker and Mendoza testified after plea deals that reduced their sentences in exchange for cooperation. Li Wei provided details about Chinese intelligence procedures, about how the purchase doctrine was being integrated into PLA training, about the strategic value of having American tactics decades before any conflict began. And through it all, Stone sat silent, declining to testify in his own defense, letting Morrison argue philosophy and motivation while the prosecution hammered facts and evidence. The verdict came on a gray morning that felt appropriate for the occasion. The panel deliberated for 8 hours before returning to the courtroom. Jack was there, had been there every day, watching the man who'd mentored him face the consequences of 2 decades of betrayal. On all counts of espionage, we find the defendant guilty. The panel president's voice was firm, unwavering. On all counts of conspiracy, guilty. On all counts of theft of government property, guilty. Stone showed no reaction, just sat there in his stripped uniform, bearing the judgment with the same stoic acceptance he'd shown through the entire trial. Sentencing would come later, after impact statements and recommendations. But everyone in the courtroom knew what it would be. Espionage during wartime carried only one sentence: death. Jack walked out into the afternoon light, feeling hollowed out. Justice had been served. The traitor had been convicted. The system had worked. But none of it felt like victory. Just necessity, just the grinding of gears in a machine that destroyed what it touched. even when it was destroying the right things. Walsh found him in the parking lot, standing next to his truck, staring at nothing. You did good in there, Jack. Your testimony was solid, professional. The conviction was never in doubt, but you made sure of it. Yeah, Jack's voice was flat. I made sure of it. Made sure my mentor will face a firing squad. That's good work. He betrayed everything you both believed in. Walsh leaned on his cane, looking every one of his 65 years. Don't take his crimes onto your shoulders. You didn't make him betray his country. You just exposed it. Did I? Or did I just do to him what he did to everyone else? Use trust as a weapon, friendship as cover, loyalty as leverage to destroy him? That's not the same thing. Walsh's voice carried certainty. You were serving justice. He was serving himself. Maybe. Jack opened his truck door. Or maybe we're all just serving whatever lets us sleep at night. And some of us are better at lying to ourselves than others. He drove away before Walsh could respond, headed back toward Fort Campbell where he still had reports to file, where Danny Kowalski was training to become the soldier his father had wanted him to be, where the system continued grinding forward like nothing had happened. 2 weeks later, the call came that changed everything again. Jack was in his quarters, packing, preparing to finally leave Fort Campbell and retire for real this time. 40 years was enough. Time to find out if there was anything left of him that wasn't mission and cover and compromise. His phone rang. Walsh. But the voice on the other end wasn't the usual operational tone. This was different. This was urgent. Jack, we have a problem. Chinese MSS has activated a sleeper network. Revenge for the blown operation. They're targeting Fort Campbell tonight. Explosives planted in trainee barracks. We've evacuated most personnel, but there's one company still on site. Training exercise, remote location, couldn't reach them in time. Which company? But Jack already knew the answer before Walsh said it. Danny Kowalski's company. Walsh's voice was grim. We've got bomb squad en route, but they're 40 minutes out. The devices are set to detonate in 30. We need someone on site who knows explosives, who can talk the squad through defusal if they're cutting it close. I'm retired. I haven't touched a bomb in 20 years. Jack was already moving, grabbing his jacket, his keys, his phone. My hands shake, Ray. I've got nerve damage from that shoulder wound. I'm the worst possible choice for this. You're the only choice on site. Mendoza already told us where the devices are planted, but we need hands on the ground. And Jack, the trainee barracks. That's where Danny is right now. The drive to the remote training site took 15 minutes that felt like hours. Jack's phone was on speaker, Walsh coordinating with bomb squad, with base security, with everyone who needed to know that they had 15 minutes to defuse Chinese-made explosives that would kill 40 young soldiers if the timer ran out. Jack arrived at the barracks to find chaos. Trainees being evacuated, drill sergeants trying to maintain order. Everyone moving with the urgent calm of people who knew something was wrong, but not how wrong. He pushed through the crowd, found Danny helping an injured soldier toward the evacuation point. Kowalski, get everyone out, now. Colonel Rearden? Danny's face showed confusion, then understanding. The evacuation order, what's happening? No time. Get them out, get to the rally point, wait for bomb squad. Bomb squad? Danny's eyes widened. There's a bomb? Multiple devices. Chinese retaliation. You have 10 minutes to clear the building. Danny started to move, then stopped. You're not evacuating, you're going in. Someone has to verify the device location, assess whether we can wait for the squad. That someone is me. Your hands shake. I've seen them shake. Danny's voice was urgent. Let me help. 2 sets of hands, better odds. You've got no training in explosive ordnance disposal. Neither do you. Not for 20 years. Danny met his eyes and Jack saw his father in that gaze. Saw the same determination, the same refusal to let someone else carry the weight alone. You taught me about never leaving a fallen comrade. You're going in there to save my brothers. I'm not letting you go alone. Jack wanted to argue, wanted to order the kid to evacuate, wanted to protect him from the choice that Jack himself had made too many times. But there was no time, and Danny was right. 2 sets of hands were better than one, even if one set belonged to someone with no experience and too much courage. They moved into the barracks together, following Mendoza's directions to the mechanical room where the devices were planted. The building was empty now, echoing with the absence of 40 soldiers who should have been there, who would have been there if Leeway's sleeper network hadn't decided that revenge was worth murdering children. The mechanical room was exactly where Mendoza said it would be. 3 devices, Chinese military grade, sophisticated timers that showed 7 minutes remaining. Jack's hands were already shaking as he examined them, and he knew that shake would get worse under pressure, would make the fine motor control needed for defusal nearly impossible. Walsh was in his ear, patching him through to the bomb squad leader, who was talking him through the device construction, identifying the triggering mechanism, explaining the defusal sequence. But explaining and doing were different things, and Jack's hands were shaking worse now, adrenaline and age and nerve damage combining into a palsy that made precision work impossible. Danny saw it, saw the shake, saw Jack's face as he realized he couldn't do this, couldn't make the cuts that needed to be made with hands that wouldn't stay steady. "Tell me what to do." Danny's voice was calm, focused. "My hands don't shake. You talk me through it. You've never done this. First time for everything. And if we don't try, 40 soldiers die, including Tyler Jackson, including everyone I've trained with for 6 months. So tell me what to do, Colonel." Jack looked at this kid, 19 years old, steady hands and too much courage, and made the same calculation his father had made at Chosin. The calculation that said some lives were worth risking your own to save. "Okay." Jack's voice dropped into the command tone he'd used for 40 years. "Okay, open the panel carefully. Don't pull, don't force, just ease it open." Danny's hands were steady as he followed instructions, opening the panel to reveal the device's interior. Wiring, timers, enough explosive to bring down the building, and everyone within 100 meters. 5 minutes remaining. The bomb squad leader was still talking, explaining the sequence, which wires to cut first, how to isolate the detonator from the explosive. Jack relayed instructions to Danny, watching the kid work with hands that didn't shake, fingers that could do the fine manipulation that Jack's couldn't anymore. Blue wire to the junction box. Cut it there, not at the connection point. Leave half an inch of wire attached. Danny cut. Perfect precision. No hesitation. The timer stopped at 3 minutes, 19 seconds. Now the red wire. But this one is tricky. If you cut wrong, it triggers immediately. Has to be exact. "Where?" Danny's voice was steady. No fear, just focus. 2 millimeters from the solder joint. Not more, not less. You have to eyeball it. Trust your judgment. Jack watched Danny measure with his eyes, position the cutters, and realized he was holding his breath. This was the moment. This was the choice that would either save everyone or kill them both. And he just put that choice in the hands of a 19-year-old kid who trusted him completely. Danny cut. The wire separated cleanly. The device went dead. No detonation, no explosion, just silence as the threat disappeared. 2 more devices. Bomb squad leader's voice was urgent. 2 minutes, 54 seconds. They moved to the second device, repeated the process. Danny's hands stayed steady while Jack's shake got worse, adrenaline fading to exhaustion. 40 years of service catching up in the worst possible moment. But Danny didn't need steady hands from Jack. Just steady commands. Just the voice of experience guiding inexperience through the dance with death. Second device diffused. 1 minute, 12 seconds on the third. The last device was different. More complex backup trigger that would detonate if the primary was disabled incorrectly. The bomb squad leader was talking faster now, urgency bleeding through professional calm, knowing that they were running out of time and out of options. Jack's vision was starting to blur, exhaustion and stress combining into something that felt like his body giving up. But he couldn't give up. Not with 40 soldiers' lives depending on him staying conscious long enough to guide Danny through the final sequence. "Danny," Jack's voice was hoarse. "This one is complicated. Multiple triggers, each one has to be disabled in sequence. If you do it wrong, even slightly wrong, we're both dead and so is everyone within blast radius." "Then I won't do it wrong." Danny's hands moved to the device. "Tell me the sequence." The bomb squad leader was giving instructions, technical jargon that Jack translated into simple commands. Danny followed each one, hands moving with the confidence of someone too young to fully understand the stakes, too brave to let understanding stop him. 57 seconds. Jack heard his own breathing, ragged and loud in the mechanical room silence. Heard Danny's breathing, calm and controlled. Heard the tick of the timer counting down their lives. 47 seconds. First bypass complete. The squad leader's voice crackled through static. Now the secondary trigger. Yellow wire to green terminal, but do not complete the circuit until I tell you. Danny's hands positioned the wire, holding it millimeters from the terminal, waiting for the command. Jack could see the kid's hands now, finally beginning to shake just slightly. Not from fear, from the adrenaline finally hitting, from the reality of what they were doing penetrating the focus. 32 seconds. Danny, Jack said quietly, you're doing great, just like the first two. Stay with me. I'm here, Colonel. Danny's voice was steady despite his shaking hands. Just tell me when. The squad leader was talking, explaining the final steps, the precise moment when Danny would have to complete the circuit without triggering the backup detonator. 1 second too early, and they'd die. 1 second too late, and the timer would expire. The window was impossibly narrow. 19 seconds. On my mark, the squad leader's voice was tight. 3, 2, 1, mark. Danny completed the circuit, his shaking hands somehow finding the precision needed, years of ranch work and manual labor translating into the fine motor control that made the difference between life and death. The timer froze at 7 seconds remaining. The silence that followed was absolute. The silence that followed was absolute. No explosion, no death, just two men in a mechanical room, surrounded by diffused bombs and the weight of choices made in the space between courage and insanity. Jack collapsed against the wall, his body finally giving up. Months of stress and a lifetime of service catching up in one moment. Danny caught him, kept him from falling, and Jack saw his father's face in the kid's features. Saw the same determination, the same willingness to die for something larger than self. You did good, kid. Jack's voice was barely a whisper. Your dad would be proud. So would yours. Danny helped him toward the door, toward fresh air and safety, and the knowledge that they'd survived something that should have killed them both. They emerged from the barracks to find the area surrounded by emergency vehicles, bomb squad, base security, everyone who'd been waiting to see if they'd live or die. Walsh was there, leaning on his cane, looking more shaken than Jack had seen him in 35 years. You crazy son of a bitch! Walsh's voice was rough with emotion. You were supposed to assess and wait, not defuse them yourself. Wasn't me, Jack gestured at Danny. Kid's got hands like a surgeon. I just told him which wires to cut. Danny Kowalski, private first class. Danny stood at attention despite everything, despite having just defused 3 bombs with seconds to spare, still maintaining military bearing. Walsh studied him for a long moment. Private, how would you like to never do anything that stupid again? Because DIA has a program for soldiers with steady hands and poor judgment. We call it recruitment. Danny looked at Jack, question in his eyes. Jack thought about his conversation with Sofia Martinez in the original timeline, about warning her away from this life, about trying to protect the next generation from the costs he'd paid. But Danny wasn't asking permission, just acknowledgement. And Jack had learned over 40 years that you couldn't protect people from their choices. You could only prepare them for the consequences. It's your decision, Danny, but if you do this, do it for the right reasons. Not revenge, not glory, not because someone told you that you should. Do it because you believe the mission matters more than comfort. And the day that stops being true, that's the day you walk away. Promise me. I promise. Danny said it with the certainty of 19, with the belief that promises made meant something, that integrity survived contact with reality. Jack hoped the kid was right. Hoped that Danny would be better at keeping promises than Jack had been. Hoped that somewhere, somehow, the next generation would find ways to serve without losing themselves in the service. But hope was all he had left. That and the knowledge that he'd survived one more mission, made one more choice, saved one more life at the cost of pushing one more kid toward the same path that had hollowed out Jack's soul over 40 years. Walsh was talking to Danny about programs and training and opportunities. Jack walked away, heading toward his truck, ready to leave Fort Campbell for the last time, ready to retire for real, to find out if there was anything left of Jack Rearden that wasn't mission and cover and compromise. Behind him, Danny Kowalski was beginning a journey that would either make him a hero or destroy him. Jack had set him on that path, had guided his hands through a dance with death, had shown him what it meant to make choices that saved lives at the cost of your own. Whether that was mentorship or corruption, Jack would spend the rest of his life trying to determine. But right now, in this moment, he'd done what he always did, completed the mission, paid the quantum, survived to question whether survival was worth the price. The sun was setting over Fort Campbell, painting the sky in colors that reminded Jack of every battlefield he'd ever seen. Colors of fire and blood, and endings that felt like beginnings if you didn't look too close at what they cost. Jack drove away from Fort Campbell for the last time, heading toward whatever came after 40 years of service, heading toward retirement, toward peace, toward the question of whether a man who'd been other people for so long could remember how to be himself. But in his rearview mirror, he saw Danny Kowalski standing with Walsh, beginning a conversation that would lead to the same choices Jack had made, the same cost Jack had paid, the same question of whether honor survived when you did whatever was necessary to serve it. And Jack knew, with the certainty of 40 years, that the cycle would continue, that the next generation would make the same mistakes and call them necessary, that someone would stand over someone else's grave someday and wonder if the sacrifice had been worth it. But that was tomorrow's question. Tonight, Jack was heading home, wherever home was for someone who'd been everywhere and belonged nowhere. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, and Jack drove into it with the same determination he'd shown for 40 years. Because that was all he knew how to do. Keep moving forward, keep surviving, keep hoping that eventually, somehow, it would all add up to something that justified the cost. The night deepened, the road continued, and Jack Rearden, or whatever remained of him after 40 years of service, drove toward an ending that felt like it might finally bring peace. Or might just be another mission in disguise. 3 months after the trial, Jack stood in a place he'd avoided for 40 years. The Korean War Veterans Memorial stretched before him in the heart of Washington, 19 steel soldiers marching through juniper bushes, faces etched with the exhaustion of men who'd fought in a war most Americans had forgotten. The pool of remembrance reflected the morning sky, its black granite inscribed with numbers that told a story of sacrifice. 54,000 American dead, 5 million total casualties. A war that ended in stalemate but cost everything. Jack found himself at the wall of faces, photographic images etched into granite, 2,000 faces representing all who served. He didn't need to search long. The memorial staff had helped him locate it years ago, though he'd never had the courage to return until now. One face among thousands. Young, barely 28, wearing the expression of someone who knew what was coming and went anyway. His father, Colonel James Rearden, died at Chosin Reservoir December 1950, holding a position so his men could evacuate in sub-zero temperatures while Chinese forces overran their lines. The medal Jack carried, the Bronze Star with V device, had been awarded posthumously for that final stand. Jack placed his hand on the cold granite, feeling the texture of the image, feeling 40 years of trying to live up to a sacrifice he'd never fully understood. "You look lost." The voice came from beside him, an old man in a faded Marine Corps jacket, maybe 75, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen Korea's frozen hell and somehow survived it. "Just visiting my father." Jack didn't take his hand from the image. He nodded at Chosin, holding the line while his unit retreated. "Chosin." The old man's voice carried the weight of personal memory. "I was there. 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, coldest I've ever been in my life. Cold that made you want to die just to stop shivering. Your father's unit, they saved a lot of lives that day, bought time with blood so the rest of us could get out. Did it matter?" Jack finally pulled his hand away. "The war ended in stalemate. Korea's still divided. All those men who died, including my father, what did they actually accomplish? They stopped communism from swallowing the peninsula." The old man gestured at the memorial. "South Korea is free today because men like your father paid for that freedom. You ever been to Seoul? Modern city, democracy, people living good lives. That's what they died for. That's what mattered." Jack looked at the memorial, at the exhausted soldiers frozen in March, at the faces on the wall, at the numbers engraved in stone. 54,000 dead, for a stalemate, for half a country, for a war most people couldn't find on a timeline. "I spent 40 years trying to make his death meaningful." Jack's voice was quiet. "Joined the army because he did. Served because he served. Thought if I sacrificed enough, it would balance what he gave. Did it work?" "No." Jack sat on a bench, facing the memorial. "I think I just added my own regrets to his sacrifice. Spent 40 years becoming other people, serving missions that may not have mattered, paying costs that may not have been worth it. And I'm still not sure if any of it honored him or just repeated his mistakes." The old man sat beside him, moving carefully with the stiffness of age and old wounds. "That's the trap we fall into, thinking we honor the dead by dying the same way. But son, your father didn't sacrifice himself so you could spend your life sacrificing yourself. He died so you could live. That's what sacrifice means. Not that you owe him death, but that you owe him life. Jack looked at this stranger who somehow understood what 40 years of service hadn't taught him. How do you honor them then? If not through service and sacrifice, how do we make their deaths mean something? By living fully, by being the person they didn't get to be, by making choices they didn't get to make. The old man stood, preparing to leave. I spent 30 years feeling guilty that I survived Chosin when better men died. 30 years half-living because I thought I didn't deserve to fully live. Then one day my grandson asked me about the war, and I realized the best way to honor my dead friends was to live well enough for both of us. That's what your father would want, not for you to die slowly over 40 years, but to live fully with the life he bought you. He walked away, leaving Jack alone with the memorial, with his father's face in granite, with the question that had defined 4 decades finally receiving an answer he could accept. The execution of General Marcus Stone happened on a cold morning in January at Fort Leavenworth, 73 years after Jack's father died at Chosin Reservoir. The symmetry felt appropriate somehow. 2 men who'd served their country, separated by generations and choices, both ending in death. One a hero, one a traitor, one remembered with honor, one with shame. Jack was required to attend as primary witness, required to watch the man who'd mentored him face consequences of 22 years of betrayal. Stone had declined appeals, declined delays, accepted his sentence with the same stoic determination he'd shown through the trial. They met one final time, 30 minutes before execution, in a room designed for final conversations between the condemned and those who'd put them there. Jack, Stone sat in prison grays, shackled but unbowed. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I need to understand something." Jack sat across from him. "You had everything. Respect, rank, legacy. What was the moment? When did you decide that selling your country was justified?" Stone was quiet for a long moment, looking at his shackled hands. "Do you remember Black Hawk Down? Mogadishu, 93. We watched Rangers in Delta fight and die because politicians wouldn't give them the support they needed. Watched them drag American bodies through streets while the world laughed at our weakness. I remember. That's when the doubt started. Not the selling, not yet, but the question of whether America had the will to use its military properly. After that, it was Somalia, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Same pattern. Send soldiers to do impossible jobs with impossible restrictions, then blame them when it goes wrong. I watched 20 years of American military excellence wasted by political cowardice. So you sold us out because politicians failed? I ensured our doctrine wouldn't die with our failures." Stone met his eyes. "Every lesson we learned, every tactic we developed, we were abandoning it. The Chinese weren't abandoning anything. They were studying, learning, preparing. So yes, I sold it to them because at least they'd use it properly instead of letting it rot in archives of lost wars. And the $10 million? That was about doctrine preservation?" Stone almost smiled. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't enjoy being paid. But Jack, think about it. I could have made more as a defense contractor, could have retired rich without committing treason. The money was proof that what I provided had real value, even if America didn't recognize it. Did you ever regret it, even once?" "No." Stone's answer came without hesitation. "I regret being caught. I regret that Leeway's network was sloppy. But selling American doctrine to people who'd actually use it? No regret whatsoever. I'd do it again knowing everything I know now." "Then you learned nothing." Jack stood. "My father died at Chosin Reservoir in 50, froze to death holding a line so his men could escape. He was 28 years old, could have retreated, could have saved himself. He chose to die believing America was worth dying for. You spent 44 years serving, then decided nothing was worth anything except your own profit. That's the difference between you. Your father died for a stalemate." Stone's voice was calm. "Korea's still divided. His sacrifice didn't unite the peninsula, didn't win the war, didn't accomplish the mission. He died for half measures and political compromise, just like every American soldier since. Maybe." Jack moved toward the door. "Or maybe sacrifice is only meaningless if the survivors decide it is. My father believed his death would protect something worth protecting. I spent 40 years questioning that belief. But watching you justify betrayal with philosophy, I realize he was right. Some things are worth dying for because The alternative is becoming what you became. A man who believes in nothing except his own cynicism. He walked out before Stone could respond, before the old arguments could spiral into the same philosophical dead ends. Stone was brilliant, articulate, could argue his position with the conviction of someone who had spent 2 decades justifying treason to himself. But brilliance didn't make him right, just made him dangerous. The execution itself was clinical. 5 rifles, 5 marksmen, 1 blank round, so no one knew for certain who delivered the killing shot. Stone stood at attention, refused the blindfold, faced his death with the same bearing he'd shown through 44 years of service. His last words were brief: "Long live the Republic, even if the Republic doesn't deserve it." Then the volley, the fall, the end. General Marcus Stone, decorated veteran, convicted traitor, dead at 62 from wounds delivered by soldiers he'd once commanded. Jack watched it all, felt nothing but a profound sadness for a man who'd let disillusionment transform into betrayal, who traded honor for money and called it pragmatism. Raymond Walsh found him in the parking lot afterward, leaning on his cane, looking older than his 65 years. "It's finished," Walsh's voice was flat. 22 years of betrayal ended with 5 rifle shots. Does it feel like closure? No. Jack watched the prison gates. It feels like waste. Stone could have been remembered as a hero. Instead, he'll be a footnote in spy scandals. All that service, all that experience, wasted because he couldn't live with the gap between what America promised and what it delivered. Most people live with that gap. Walsh started toward his car. The difference is most people don't betray everything they swore to protect just because reality disappointed them. Maybe the difference is some people break under the weight and others don't. Jack followed him. Stone broke. I've been close to breaking. The question is what separates those who hold on from those who let go. Belief. Walsh stopped at his car. Belief that the work still matters, even when everything suggests it doesn't. You kept that belief through 40 years of missions that tested it. Stone lost it, and it destroyed him. That's the only difference that matters. Jack drove to Montana the next day, to the cabin he'd purchased with retirement savings, to 20 acres of silence far from anything that mattered. The cabin sat with mountains in the distance and a river nearby, perfect isolation for someone who'd spent 40 years surrounded by people and needed to remember how to be alone. He spent 3 months learning that being alone was harder than any mission he'd ever completed. At least missions had objectives, success criteria, endings. Solitude just stretched on indefinitely, offering no validation, no sense of accomplishment, no way to measure whether you were doing it right. He was splitting firewood behind the cabin when Danny Kowalski's truck appeared on the dirt road. The kid stepped out in civilian clothes, looking older than his 20 years, moving with the careful awareness that came from operational experience. "Colonel Rearden," Danny approached with the same respect he'd shown at Fort Campbell. "Hope you don't mind the visit. Director Walsh gave me your address." "Danny, what brings you to Montana? Shouldn't you be finishing DIA training?" "Just graduated." Danny pulled a medal from his pocket, Bronze Star with V device. "Got this for the bomb defusal. They're having me do recruiting speeches about service and sacrifice. But you're here instead, because the speeches are lies." Danny sat on the woodpile. "They talk about honor like it's simple, like you can serve for 40 years and not pay costs that accumulate in ways you can't predict. You taught me different, Colonel. You showed me service means becoming someone you don't always recognize." "I taught you wrong then." Jack set down the axe. "You should walk away now while you can still choose a different path." "Too late." Danny met his eyes. "I just finished an operation I can't discuss in a country I can't name. Made choices I can't defend for outcomes I have to trust mattered. You were right about the costs. They come faster than expected and heavier than promised. Then walk away. It's not too late." "It is, though." Danny's voice carried the weight of someone who'd already made the calculation. "I believe the mission matters. That's the trap, isn't it? Once you believe, once you accept that some things are worth the costs, you can't stop paying. You just hope the balance comes out positive eventually." Jack looked at this kid who reminded him of himself at 20, who'd been set on a path that would either make him great or destroy him, who was asking the same questions Jack had been asking for 40 years. "Then let me tell you what I learned." Jack sat beside him. "My father died at Chosin Reservoir in 1950. He was 28 years old, froze to death holding a position so his unit could evacuate. I spent 40 years trying to honor that sacrifice by making the same kinds of sacrifices. Thought if I served long enough, sacrificed enough, it would balance what he gave.
Did it?
No, because I was honoring him wrong. I was trying to become him instead of becoming the person his sacrifice allowed me to be. Jack pulled out a small photograph he still carried, his father in Army uniform, young and alive. He didn't die so I could spend 40 years dying slowly in his image. He died so I could live. That's what sacrifice means, Danny. Not that you owe the dead more death, but that you owe them life. How do you live when the work keeps demanding you die? Danny's question cut to the core. Every mission, every operation, every choice asks you to sacrifice another piece of yourself. How do you serve without losing everything? You remember why you're serving. Jack met his eyes. Serve for yourself, not for ghosts. Not because your father wanted it. Not because some mentor told you to. Not because you're trying to prove something. Serve because you believe the mission matters more than your comfort. And the day that stops being true, the day the costs outweigh your belief, that's when you walk away. Promise me you'll recognize that day when it comes. I promise. Danny stood, and Colonel, I want you to know something. You're the reason I'm doing this. Not because you recruited me, but because you showed me what it looks like to serve with honor, even when honor demands terrible things. You're my model for how to do this right. Then be better than me. Jack stood as well. Learn from my mistakes instead of repeating them. Find the balance I couldn't find. Serve without losing yourself. That's how you honor what I tried to teach you. Danny left, and Jack returned to his firewood, to the simple physical work that kept his hands busy, while his mind processed what had just happened. He'd set Danny on the path that had nearly destroyed him. Whether that was mentorship or corruption, Jack would spend the rest of his life trying to determine. 2 months later, the letter arrived from the Pentagon. Official letterhead signed by the Secretary of Defense, requesting Jack's presence at a ceremony where he'd receive the Distinguished Intelligence Medal for exposing the largest espionage network in modern American history. Jack almost declined, almost sent a polite refusal saying he'd retired, didn't need recognition, wanted to be left alone. But Walsh called personally. It's not about the medal, Jack. It's about closure. For you and for everyone affected by Stone's betrayal. Come let people thank you. You earned it. So Jack went to Washington, wore his dress uniform one final time, accepted thanks from people who'd never know the full cost of what he'd done to earn their gratitude. The ceremony was at the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense read the citation, reducing 40 years of compromises to bullet points in official language that made everything sound heroic. Colonel Rearden's dedication to duty, his courage under impossible circumstances, and his unwavering commitment to justice prevented catastrophic damage to national security and ensured traitors faced appropriate consequences. Jack accepted the medal, shook hands, posed for photographs that would be filed and forgotten. Through it all, he felt the weight of what wasn't being said, the abuse he'd witnessed and documented instead of stopped, the innocent woman whose career he'd destroyed to maintain his cover, the keys that heroism extracted from everyone it touched. After the ceremony, he found Danny in the crowd, now wearing his own Bronze Star among other decorations. The kid had changed in 6 months, carried himself with the careful control of someone who'd made operational choices and lived with their consequences. Congratulations, Colonel. Distinguished Intelligence Medal? That's something. It's a piece of metal on a ribbon. Jack kept his voice low. What it represents is 40 years of compromises dressed up as heroism. You taught me something important, Colonel. Danny's voice was steady. You taught me that the compromises don't make you less than hero. They make you more human. Perfect heroes don't exist. Only people who do hard things for good reasons and live with the costs. I hope you're right. Jack looked at this kid who still believed, who hadn't been broken yet by the work. Because if you're wrong, if the costs eventually outweigh the reasons, I need you to promise me you'll walk away. Don't let this work take everything from you the way it almost took everything from me. I won't. But Danny certainly felt fragile. I'll remember what you taught me. About serving for the right reasons. About recognizing when the costs become too high. About walking away when belief stops being enough. He walked away, leaving Jack alone with his medal and his doubts in the question of whether he'd helped or harmed the next generation by showing them how to do work that required becoming someone you didn't want to be. The reception afterward was typical Washington, powerful people making conversation that meant nothing, offering congratulations that felt obligatory. Jack endured it until he saw a face he recognized. Tyler Jackson, the kid who'd been beaten in the shower while Jack documented instead of intervening. Tyler wore sergeant's stripes now, carried himself with confidence born of surviving what should have destroyed him. Colonel Rearden, Tyler approached with military bearing. Wanted to thank you personally for what you did. You should hate me. Jack's voice was blunt. I watched you suffer and chose mission over mercy. That's not something that deserves thanks. I did hate you. For a while. Tyler's honesty was refreshing. Felt betrayed. Felt like you'd used my pain as evidence instead of stopping it. But then I understood. You weren't just documenting my abuse. You were documenting a system that allowed abuse. And you stopped it. Because of you, kids coming after me won't suffer what I suffered. That doesn't make what I did right. No, but it makes it necessary. Tyler extended his hand. You taught me something, Colonel. That sometimes right choices feel wrong. That serving means making impossible decisions. That the world doesn't offer easy answers. I've carried that lesson into my own service, and it's made me better even if it's made me harder. Jack shook his hand, felt the strength there, saw that Tyler had survived and even grown from what should have broken him. Maybe some people were strong enough to metabolize trauma into wisdom. Maybe not everyone who paid costs was destroyed by them. After the ceremony, Jack drove back toward Montana, toward his cabin, toward the question of what came next. But instead of going straight there, he made a detour. Back to Washington, back to the Korean War Veterans Memorial one final time. The memorial was quiet in evening light, 19 steel soldiers frozen in March, their faces showing the exhaustion of men who'd fought in forgotten cold. The pool of remembrance reflected the sunset, numbers etched in granite telling a story of sacrifice most Americans never learned. Jack stood before his father's face on the wall, carrying the bronze star he'd promised to return. He placed the medal on the stone ledge before the image, where dozens of other mementos had been left by families and veterans over the years. A final offering, a closing of accounts. Dad, Jack's voice was barely a whisper. I finished the mission. Exposed the spy ring, brought the traitors to justice. Stone is dead. The network is dismantled. I did what needed doing. He paused, organizing thoughts that had been accumulating since his first visit 3 months ago. But I also learned something. I learned I've been trying to honor your sacrifice the wrong way. Trying to die slowly over 40 years instead of living fully with the life you bought me. An old Marine told me you didn't die so I could spend my life dying. You died so I could live. The evening breeze moved through the memorial, rustling the juniper bushes, carrying the distant sounds of Washington traffic. I don't know how to do that yet. Don't know how to live instead of serve, but I'm going to learn. Going to spend whatever time I have left becoming Jack Rearden again instead of being Colonel Rearden or Tom Mitchell or whoever else the mission needed me to be. That's how I'm going to honor you now, by living. He stood there for a long time, watching the light fade, watching shadows lengthen across the memorial. Finally, he spoke one more time. Thank you for the life you gave me, Dad. I'm sorry it took 40 years to understand what that gift meant, but I understand now. And I'm going to try to live in a way that makes your sacrifice worth what it cost. Jack turned and walked away from the memorial, from the bronze star resting on stone, from 40 years of trying to balance scales that could never be balanced. Behind him, his father's face remained etched in granite, forever young, forever 28, forever frozen in the moment before Chosin Reservoir claimed him. He drove back to Montana as night fell, as Washington gave way to countryside, as the weight of medals and ceremonies faded into distance. The cabin waited, 20 acres of silence, mountains and rivers, and space to figure out who Jack Rearden was when he stopped being everyone else. It wouldn't be easy, probably wouldn't be peaceful, might not even be possible after 40 years of being other people, but it was necessary. Because his father hadn't died at Chosin Reservoir, so Jack could spend 40 years dying at Fort Campbell and Leavenworth and 1,000 other places. He died so Jack could live. And living, Jack was beginning to understand, was harder than any mission, required more courage than any operation, demanded more from you than any sacrifice. But it was the only way to truly honor the dead, not by joining them slowly, but by living fully with the time they'd purchased. The road stretched ahead, had empty and dark, but not frightening anymore. Just a path toward whatever came next, toward learning how to be one person instead of many, toward accepting that some scales couldn't be balanced, some debts couldn't be repaid, Some sacrifices could only be honored by living well enough for both the living and the dead. Jack drove into the Montana night, toward his cabin, towards silence, toward the question of whether a man who'd spent 40 years being other people could remember how to be himself. And for the first time in 40 years, he thought maybe the answer was yes. Not because the work was finished, it would never be finished. Not because the costs were paid, they could never be fully paid. Not because he'd found peace. Peace wasn't something you found, just something you built piece by piece from whatever remained after war took everything else. But because he finally understood what his father's sacrifice had purchased. Not obligation, not debt, not guilt. Just life. Simple, complicated, messy, beautiful life. And that was enough. The headlights cut through darkness, illuminating 20 feet of road at a time, showing him the path forward without revealing the destination. That was all anyone ever got. 20 feet of certainty in an uncertain world. 20 feet of light in the dark. Jack followed those 20 feet toward home, toward whatever came next, toward the rest of his life that his father had bought with the end of his. And he drove knowing that the best way to honor sacrifice wasn't through more sacrifice. It was through living, fully, honestly, courageously. Being the person your dead couldn't be. Making the choices they never got to make. Walking the paths they never got to walk. That was the gift. That was the burden. That was the only way to make their deaths mean something. Jack drove on, and behind him, in a memorial in Washington, a bronze star rested on stone beside a face frozen in time, marking a sacrifice made 73 years ago that had finally, after 40 years of misunderstanding, been properly honored. Not with more death, but with life. And that made all the difference.